Hi guys. Tonight we settle into a world where the cold creeps in long before the sun goes down, and you feel it press against your skin the way a determined stranger leans on a locked door. You imagine yourself on a narrow path powdered with ice, your boots crunching in a slow and steady rhythm while your breath blooms as ghostly clouds in the dark. Everything around you is quiet except for the groan of frozen branches and the faint hiss of wind weaving through bare trees. Out here you understand why pioneers looked over their shoulders more often than they liked to admit. Anyone who stepped into this frontier knew the nights were long and the temperatures were merciless. And if you are being honest with yourself, you probably will not survive this cold long enough to worry about your bedtime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you feel like sharing, let me know your location and the local time because I love knowing where you are drifting off from. Now, dim the lights and let yourself ease into the story as you trudge forward into the freezing wilderness, following the dim outline of a frontier cabin that waits just ahead. You keep walking until your fingertips tingle from the cold and your eyes follow the wavering lamplight flickering behind the frosted window. You picture the pioneers who walked this same path with numb hands gripping tools and bundles, knowing that every night could mean the difference between waking with stiff fingers or not waking at all. That is not an exaggeration. One mainstream fact about frontier life is that winter killed more settlers than any other season because exposure and illness often arrived long before anyone could prepare. You might find that oddly comforting, in a crooked sort of way. It is a reminder that you are stepping into a world where survival had no patience for hesitation. As you approach the cabin, snow swirls around your boots in little spirals. The structure itself looks humble and rough. The logs are stacked with gaps, the door is uneven, and the roof seems to sag a little in the center. It almost feels alive the way it creaks when the wind pushes against it. There is a quirky tidbit that might amuse you in this freezing moment. Some pioneers believed that if a cabin made too much noise on a cold night, it meant spirits were stretching inside the walls. It probably came from boredom or stress, but it is charming in its own strange way. You push your hand against the wooden latch and the sound of the wind dulls the moment the door budges inward. You step through and your cheeks prickle from the sudden change in air. The inside is dim and still. The heat from the small iron stove in the corner fights bravely against the cold that seeps through every surface. The logs of the walls feel rigid, and your breath hangs faintly in the air. You inhale deeply. The smell of aged wood, burnt sap, and damp wool wraps around you in a heavy comfort. Your eyes wander to the beams overhead. They look solid but not elegant. Everything in this place was built with the blunt determination of someone who knew that sleep was a luxury earned through hours of exhausting labor. You let your shoulders drop as you picture the settlers who entered this same room. They would stamp their feet, shake off snow, and hope the fire inside had not burned too low. Historians still argue whether the earliest frontier cabins were actually built to withstand the deadly cold, or if families simply adapted faster than their shelters could. Some say the structures were never meant for deep winter and were only improved after harsh seasons punished the unprepared. Others insist the earliest builders knew exactly what they were doing. What you do know for certain is that you feel a quiet respect growing for anyone who tried to sleep here without the insulated walls and easy comforts you take for granted. Your fingers drift along the rough interior as you step farther in. Every board feels cold and slightly uneven. The air trembles each time the wind hits the exterior. It is a constant reminder that these walls operate more like suggestions than barriers. This is not a modern home where temperatures stay obediently inside. Here you feel like you are sharing a space with the outdoor world, separated only by old timber, wishful thinking, and a slowly warming stove. You pull off your gloves and tuck them into your coat. The warmth does not come quickly. It arrives in thin layers, brushing your skin in hesitant strokes. You realize how sensitive your body becomes in this environment, noticing each tiny shift in temperature. The pioneers felt that same thing. Their skin always on alert, always adjusting, always reading the air for hints of change. They would look toward the fire the way you might look at a phone charger when your battery is low. A silent plea for more energy. A shared understanding that comfort is never guaranteed in this place. You set your pack down on the floor and straighten your posture. You hear the faint pop of the fire in the stove. Sparks dance behind the iron grate. Wood crackles softly. The cabin has a heartbeat now. You can almost imagine the family who lived here. Their boots by the wall. Their wool coats hung near the stove to dry. Their voices soft and tired after a day of working in temperatures that would send most modern people straight back inside. You are stepping into their bedtime world, where the rituals of settling down for the night were both practical and precious. You look toward the center of the room where the bed frame sits. It is nothing more than rough planks held together with stubborn nails. Yet you know it meant everything. It meant a chance to rest, even briefly. You consider what it must have been like to come inside after a day of chopping wood or tending animals in the cold. You feel a flicker of awe for these early settlers who did all of it without electric lamps, without thermal boots, without the reassuring hum of modern heat. You take another step, letting your body adjust to the cabin and the way it wraps its imperfect warmth around you. It is not luxurious, but it is real. It is honest about what it can give you and what it cannot. You feel the night settling outside, creeping deeper into the trees. The cold presses gently against the windows. The cabin creaks again, almost like a sigh. You breathe out slowly and let yourself accept the rhythm of this frozen frontier, knowing that your night has only just begun and that sleep is something you will have to earn in this place. The story flows quietly around you now, pulling you deeper into the life of the pioneers who once stood exactly where you are standing. You move farther into the dim cabin, closing the rough wooden door behind you until it thuds with a dull and imperfect seal. The sound is strangely final, like drawing a thin line between two worlds. Outside is the frozen wilderness you just crossed, and inside is a space that feels like it is still deciding whether it wants to welcome you or test you. Your breath drifts in front of you in slow curls, fading only when it reaches the faint warmth that radiates from the small stove in the corner. The first breath you take in this room is sharp, cold enough to make your teeth ache for a moment before your lungs settle. Pioneers knew this sensation well. They walked into their homes at night, fully expecting the interior to be nearly as cold as the outdoors, at least until the fire caught up and pushed back the chill. You take another step, letting your body adjust to the cabin and the way it wraps its imperfect warmth around you. It is not luxurious, but it is real. It is honest about what it can give you and what it cannot. You feel the night settling outside, creeping deeper into the trees. The cold presses gently against the windows. The cabin creaks again, almost like a sigh. The result was a space that could keep out wildlife and rain, but had no intention of being warm without hours of dedicated fire tending. You can almost sense the air moving in slow currents, flowing through the thin places between logs. The temperature inside shifts gently, like the cabin itself is breathing with you. You step closer to the tiny window at the far wall, its panes fogged and edged with frost. One quirky tidbit you might appreciate as you look at it is that some settlers used greased paper instead of glass, because glass was expensive and difficult to transport. That translucent paper let in a soft glow, but did almost nothing to keep in the heat. Even the families with glass windows often covered them with blankets at night. The one in front of you looks like a luxury by frontier standards, though the icy white ferns forming along its edges make it obvious that the cold has no trouble slipping past it. You place your palm against the wall next to the window. It is firm and smooth in some places, but rough and splintered in others. Your fingers skim along the chinking and feel bits of hardened mud and packed fiber. You wonder how settlers managed to sleep while knowing the walls leaked warmth as easily as a poorly tied knot leaks water. Historians still argue whether this type of early log construction was genuinely functional for winter or whether families survived more because of sheer resilience than architecture. Some researchers insist the cabins perform surprisingly well when properly maintained, while others argue that most pioneer homes were cold enough to make sleep an ongoing challenge rather than a peaceful end to the day. You draw a slow inhalation, letting your senses adjust to the room. The air smells like burning sap mixed with damp wool and old timber that has absorbed decades of smoke. It is a scent that feels grounding and ancient. You can imagine countless families breathing this same combination as they stepped inside after a long day. You kneel near the floorboards and notice how uneven they are. Some planks sit slightly higher than others. You run your hand over the surface and feel the cold rising from below. Many frontier cabins were built directly on the ground without foundations, which meant frost crept upward through the floors. You feel that chill now. It is the kind that settles in your bones if you are not careful. A faint creak echoes overhead as the wind presses against the roof. The ceiling beams shift slightly with the pressure. The sound has a strangely comforting rhythm, like an old house whispering its age. You imagine the families who lay awake on winter nights listening to the same creaks, trying to decide whether the roof was expanding in the cold or whether a storm was creeping in. The room around you feels compact, built with a purpose that has nothing to do with aesthetics. Everything here exists because someone needed it, not because it looked good. You take a few steady steps toward the stove. Its small iron body radiates what little heat it can, creating a pocket of warmth that reaches no farther than a few feet. You hold your hands out toward it and feel the relief, but also the limitation. You can almost hear a pioneer mother or father muttering about the need to feed it constantly through the night. That tiny stove was the heart of the home. If it went out, the temperature inside the cabin could plummet quickly enough to make sleep dangerous. You picture the firewood stacked in a corner, chopped in uneven pieces. Some of it probably green, some of it split too small or too large, all of it valuable enough to ration carefully. Your eyes drift again to the walls and the ceiling, noticing shadows shifting as the fire flickers. The light moves in soft strokes, making the cabin look alive. You take another breath and realize that despite the cold, the space has a small hint of coziness. Not modern comfort, not a plush warmth, but a quiet intimacy realized only when darkness settles and firelight becomes the only living glow. The pioneers must have felt a similar mix of hardship and tenderness. The cabin was flawed, cold, and sometimes miserable, yet it held the fragile warmth of family and survival. You walk slowly around the room, allowing your fingertips to skim every surface. The table wobbles slightly when you touch it. The wooden pegs holding it together feel loose. A chair creaks at the slightest weight. These objects were used daily, repaired constantly, and pushed far past what modern furniture would tolerate. You imagine a child sitting in that creaking chair, rubbing tired eyes after a long day. Their parents might be laying out quilts or tending the fire. The soundscape of this cabin was always working, always doing, always patching itself together through necessity. You pause near the bed frame again and look at the corner where cold gathers like a silent pool. You notice how the shadows deepen there, how the air seems more still. It is strange to think that this space, so small and so chilly, was the final refuge each night. The pioneers ended their days surrounded by the same uncertainties and discomforts that met them in the morning. Yet they learned to breathe through it, to ease into the night with a sense of acceptance. You feel that same acceptance settling into you now, like the cabin is teaching you how to exist in this place without fighting it. You let your hand trail along the bed frame and feel how solid the wood is, even in its roughness. You sense the stiffness in the air, the faint promise of rest, and the ongoing battle between warmth and cold that every night here demanded. As you stand in that quiet space, your breath becoming softer and slower, the cabin begins to feel familiar. It is as though you have stepped into the same end-of-day rhythm the pioneers once knew, preparing yourself not just to sleep but to adapt to the room, one breath at a time. You stand beside the faintly glowing stove a moment longer, letting your fingers thaw just enough to move again without stiffness. The air in the cabin is still cold, cold enough that your breath shows each time you exhale. But at least the fire has edged the sharpest chill away. Now your attention shifts to your clothing, heavy with moisture from melted snow. You can feel it soaking into the fabric, chilling you anew with every movement. The pioneers faced this same routine countless times. Coming inside was not the end of the cold. It was only the beginning of a delicate dance to stay warm through the night. You unbutton your coat slowly, feeling the stiffness of frozen cloth resisting your hands. The outer layer crackles faintly from ice crystals trapped deep in the fibers. When you slip the coat off, a wave of cold air brushes your skin. Your sleeves cling to your forearms, heavy and slightly damp. Settlers knew this feeling intimately. Every winter day left them with clothing soaked from sweat, snow, or sleet, all of which became a chilling hazard the moment they stepped indoors. A mainstream historical fact is that wet clothing was one of the leading causes of hypothermia during frontier winters. With no central heating, you had to dry every layer by the stove before you could sleep, or you risked waking in the night shivering uncontrollably. You moved toward the pegs on the wall, the simple wooden hooks hammered in at uneven angles. You drape your coat there, then peel away your outer shirt, tugging gently where the damp fabric clings. As you do, you imagine how settlers managed this nightly ritual with minimal light and exhausted hands, often after working sunrise to sunset. Many cabins had only a single lantern or the glow of the stove, leaving most of the room in shadow. The dimness gave everything a soft blur, the kind that makes even simple tasks feel dreamlike and slow. A quirky little tidbit might surprise you here. Some pioneers placed hot stones inside boots to help them dry faster, though the stones sometimes scorched the leather or cracked the seams. Still, when your only other option was wearing frozen boots the next morning, you would probably try anything. You look down at your own boots. They are coated in frost and mud. You pull them off with effort, feeling that satisfying release as your heels finally slip free. Your socks are damp too, stiff around the toes. You shake them out gently, knowing they need to be near the stove soon or they will harden like boards by morning. You place your damp clothes on a makeshift drying rack beside the stove. The rack is nothing more than a few branches lashed together with twine, a simple solution that countless settlers used. You drape your socks and shirt over it, then place your boots underneath to catch the rising warmth. Already the water trapped in the fabric begins to release tiny curls of steam. The wet smell blends with the smoke in the room. You feel your skin prickle as it slowly adjusts to the cool interior. You touch your underlayer, the final barrier between you and the cold. It is damp too, especially across your back where sweat gathered under your coat. You hesitate before pulling it off. Removing too much clothing too fast in a frontier cabin was risky, because these walls do not hold warmth well. Historians still debate whether settlers changed clothes every night, or whether they simply slept in the same layers for days at a time to retain heat. Some accounts insist that nightly changing was essential to avoid moisture buildup, while others suggest families slept in multiple layers without bothering to remove anything unless it was soaked. The truth probably varied from cabin to cabin, influenced by resources, climate, and personal habits. You decide to remove your underlayer anyway. The cold wraps around you instantly, biting across your shoulders and arms. You inhale sharply as goosebumps rise. But the relief of being free from damp fabric outweighs the chill. You take the garment to the rack and spread it carefully so it dries evenly. You know from stories that settlers often rotated clothes throughout the evening, shifting garments closer to or farther from the stove to prevent scorching. You glance at your rack and imagine doing the same, turning pieces every hour or so whenever you wake. You step away from the stove and feel how quickly the temperature drops when you move into the darker parts of the cabin. The floorboards send a slow, creeping cold up through your feet. It makes you understand why pioneers often kept a pair of thick socks exclusively for sleeping, never worn outside, never allowed to get damp. Your own feet feel bare and vulnerable. You rub them together gently as you walk, trying to coax some warmth back into them. You look around the cabin as you continue this small ritual of removing and arranging your clothing. The room feels more spacious now that your eyes have adjusted. The shadows dance softly along the log walls, pulling your attention from one corner to another. You walk toward the small table near the center. Its surface is littered with simple tools, a tin cup and a candle stub. You pick up the cup, feeling the cold metal bite into your fingers. You wonder if the settlers who owned this cup felt the same sharp chill whenever they used it at night. The candle catches your eye next. Its wick is blackened and bent. Someone used it recently. Someone sat here, perhaps rubbing their hands over the flame, or stitching torn clothing under its weak glow. You imagine them shaking snow from their coat, placing their gloves near the stove, and complaining softly about the endless winter. Even in the harshest conditions, people still grumbled. That quiet human frustration makes them feel closer to you. You take a moment to stretch your arms and roll your shoulders. Without the weight of heavy winter clothes, you feel lighter, more grounded. The cabin responds with its own sounds, the groan of a settling log, the faint hiss of wind pushing against the chinking. The cold is still here, still trying to seep into your bones, but the fire's presence keeps it at a respectful distance. You walk back to your drying clothes and check them again. Dampness clings stubbornly to the fibers. You move each piece an inch closer to the stove. Settlers learned quickly that drying clothes required patience and constant monitoring. If you placed them too near the heat, they could catch fire or stiffen in strange shapes. Too far away, and they would remain damp until morning. Finding the perfect balance was another nightly challenge in a life full of challenges. You step back from the rack and take a slow breath. Your body is still cold, but not painfully so. You are beginning to settle into the cabin's rhythm, adapting to the space the way millions of settlers once had to. There is a quiet acceptance that comes with this process, an understanding that comfort is something you build piece by piece through small actions. You rub your hands together for warmth and let your gaze settle on the bed. Soon, once your clothes have dried enough, you will turn your attention to the mattress waiting in the corner. But for now you simply stand in the glow of the fire, letting the moisture evaporate from your layers, letting tension slip from your shoulders, and letting the cabin draw you into the world the pioneers once called home. You turn back toward the small iron stove, its glow pulsing gently like a tired heartbeat. The flicker of light stretches across the cabin floor in wavering lines, and you feel the faint warmth brushing your skin as if the fire is greeting you. Fire was everything out here, not just for cooking or heating, but for surviving the night. One well-documented detail from frontier life is that cabins often relied on a single heating source, usually a cast-iron stove or a crude stone hearth, and that single glow determined whether families slept soundly or shivered until dawn. You sense that truth now, because even standing only a few steps from the stove, your breath still lingers in the air like a pale ghost. You kneel beside the stove and lift the iron lid using the crook handle. The heat spills upward, a sharp rush that tingles your face. Inside, the fire is alive but not vigorous. The wood burns unevenly, with a few stubborn pieces refusing to catch properly. You watch the flames curl around them, licking at the damp bark. Many settlers faced this exact frustration. Newly chopped wood was often slightly wet from snow or internal moisture, and without seasoned logs, fires could struggle all night. The hiss and pop of reluctant wood fills the quiet room. You reach for a few sticks from the nearby pile. The stack looks like a mismatched collection of branches, knots, and half-split chunks. Nothing uniform, nothing ideal, just whatever the pioneers could cut before the sun slipped away. As you sort through the pieces, you notice how some feel lighter and drier, the kind that burn quickly and give instant heat. Others feel heavier and cold to the touch, holding pockets of moisture deep inside. Using these requires patience. And as you feed a couple into the stove, you feel like you are participating in the same nightly ritual settlers relied on for comfort. You close the iron lid again and listen as the flames begin to crackle with more enthusiasm. A soft glow spills into the cabin. That thin glow has a way of softening everything. The walls seem less harsh. The shadows feel slower. Even the floorboards look calmer, as if the fire reminds each part of the cabin to relax. You hold your palms in front of the stove, turning them slowly, savoring the gradual warmth that seeps into your fingertips. The pioneers often did this before bed, letting the fire warm their hands so they could complete nighttime chores more easily. As you sit there, another small curiosity from frontier life drifts into your mind. You might get a smile from knowing that some settlers believed tossing salt into the fire at night would keep mischievous spirits from entering the cabin. It was not a universal practice, but enough diaries and letters mention it to suggest it played a quiet part in nightly routines. The fire was not just practical. It was symbolic, emotionally comforting, even a little mystical at times. You close the iron lid again and listen as the flames begin to crackle with more enthusiasm. A soft glow spills into the cabin. That thin glow has a way of softening everything. The walls seem less harsh. The shadows feel slower. Even the floorboards look calmer, as if the fire reminds each part of the cabin to relax. You hold your palms in front of the stove, turning them slowly, savoring the gradual warmth that seeps into your fingertips. While you watch the flames, you become aware of the constant negotiation that pioneers had with their stoves. Feeding the fire was not a simple task. It required tending every few hours, sometimes more often if the wood was poor or the night unusually cold. There is ongoing debate among experts about how frequently families actually woke to add fuel, with some accounts claiming hourly checks and others insisting that a well-packed stove could last until morning. You open the stove once more and adjust a few of the logs, nudging them closer so the flame can spread evenly. The heat washes over your face again, this time stronger. You close the lid gently, mindful of the loud clang it tends to produce. In a small cabin, every sharp sound echoes, and you imagine how a sudden noise at night might wake every member of a family sleeping just a few feet away. Quiet was not just polite, but necessary. You sit back onto your heels, listening to the fire settle. The sound is soft yet lively, like a whispering companion keeping you company while the rest of the world lies frozen outside. You glance around the cabin and wonder how many different lives once depended on such a stove. Children with flushed cheeks warming tiny hands, parents exhausted from chopping wood, hoping the embers lasted through the coldest hours. Grandparents sitting close, wrapped in quilts, grateful for every small spark. You stand and stretch your shoulders, feeling the warm air brush upward through the space around you. Even so, you can still sense the cold waiting in the corners. The farther you step from the stove, the more the temperature drops. It reminds you that every pioneer learned the art of positioning. Beds, chairs, and sleeping furs were often arranged strategically to capture as much heat as possible. Too close and you risked scorching blankets or filling the air with smoke. Too far and you spent the night trembling. You take a moment to check your clothes on the drying rack again. The fabric closest to the stove is beginning to soften and warm, releasing small threads of steam. The pieces farther away remain cold and stiff. You shift them gently, finding a balance that allows the fire to dry everything without causing damage. It is a small task, but standing there, adjusting damp garments in a dim cabin warmed only by an uncertain flame, gives you a sudden appreciation for how much of pioneer life was spent in this exact posture. You walk once more toward the fire and crouch beside it. The warmth radiates up your arms, needing tension from your muscles. You let your eyes drift half closed. Even though the stove is not large, its glow wraps around you like a soft blanket. You inhale the scent of burning pine and oak, mixed with resin and a faint hint of smoke that has settled into the cabin walls over many winters. You stay there for several long breaths, letting the warmth soothe you. Eventually you stand again, knowing that the fire is just strong enough to keep the cabin alive for now. There will be more tending later, but at least you have coaxed a steady burn from wood that did not want to cooperate. With your clothes slowly drying, your hands warm, and the fire stable, you turn your attention toward the rest of the evening. The night is far from over, and the cabin is full of small challenges waiting for you. But in this moment, with the stove glowing patiently behind you, you feel ready to face the next part of settling into a frontier night. You step away from the stove, letting the last threads of heat slip from your fingertips as you cross the room. The cabin feels larger now that your eyes have adjusted to the dimness, but it also feels uneven, like a place built in a hurry by hands too tired to worry about straight lines. You walk toward the center and notice immediately how the floorboards shift beneath your weight. One lifts slightly at the corner. Another dips inward, as if the earth beneath had frozen and thawed one time too many. Early settlers dealt with these quirks constantly. Surviving accounts repeatedly mention that frontier cabins rarely stayed level for long because the ground below was never fully stable and logs warped with every season. You take another step and feel a subtle tilt beneath your heel, a quiet reminder that comfort was never guaranteed in a place like this. Pioneers had to accept the cabin as a living thing that changed shape over time. In a curious little detail from settler diaries, some families joked that their homes walked downhill during the winter. Not literally, of course, but enough shifting happened that furniture sometimes traveled a few inches over the course of a season. You feel that unevenness now as you move toward the rough bed frame in the corner. The bed creaks softly when you brush it with your hand. The wood is sturdy but warped, the kind of handmade construction that relies more on determination than precision. You trace one finger along a groove carved unintentionally by years of use. This simple piece of furniture held generations of restless nights, aching muscles and quiet conversations whispered under quilts while wind rattled the walls. You imagine a family gathering here at the end of a long day, all of them settling into whatever space they could find. The pioneers often slept several to a bed, sharing warmth and comfort in the coldest months. You crouch near the floor and slide your fingers along the bottom edge of the frame. A chill rises from the boards, crawling slowly up your hand. You understand instantly why many families placed rugs, animal hides, or even flattened sacks beneath their beds. Anything that added a layer between the cold earth and the straw mattress offered relief. The cold coming from below is different from the cold in the air. It is deeper, heavier, almost deliberate. You stand again and look at the table nearby. Its legs are uneven, one shorter than the others. It wobbles as you touch it. Settlers often jammed bits of bark or folded cloth under a short table leg to keep it steady, but the fix rarely lasted long. The constant shifting of the cabin pulled everything out of alignment. You pick up the candle resting there and feel the wax cool and firm. When you set it down, the table tilts enough that the candle leans to the side. You steady it with a hand, imagining how many times the original residents had to prevent spills or accidents in the night. Your gaze drifts toward the far wall where the logs meet at imperfect angles. Gaps appear in a few places, not large enough to see through but wide enough to let drafts in. You feel faint streams of cold air sneak along your arms. Settlers spent countless evenings patching these cracks with mud or cloth. The work never seemed to end, because winter weather constantly pushed at their efforts. Researchers continue to discuss whether the earliest builders intentionally left gaps for ventilation, or whether the shifting wood simply created them over time. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Families often slept in rooms with constant breezes slipping through the walls. You walk closer to the wall and press your palm to the wood. The surface feels uneven beneath your skin, smooth in some places, rough in others. The logs creak faintly as if acknowledging your touch. The cabin adjusts to the cold just as you do. Each board expands and contracts depending on the temperature. As you run your hand along the length of the wall, you feel tiny ridges where the wood has split over many seasons. You step back and let your eyes take in the entire room. Nothing is symmetrical. The angles are off. The ceiling slants slightly to one side. Even the stovepipe leans like it is tired and resting its weight on the roof beam. Yet despite all these imperfections, the cabin has its own kind of beauty. It has survived years of storms and freezing nights, and it stands here now offering you a fragile shelter. There is something quietly comforting in that resilience. You walk toward the corner where a small chest sits. Its lid is uneven, one side higher than the other. You lift it and it sticks for a moment before opening with a reluctant groan. Inside you see old cloths, maybe remnants of quilts or shirts long worn out. You picture a pioneer mother sewing by firelight, patching clothing until the last scraps had been used. You close the chest gently and listen as it clicks shut, the sound echoing softly in the hollow room. A shift in the wind outside makes the cabin groan again. The sound slides along the walls like a low hum. For a moment you stand perfectly still, letting your ears adjust to the layered noises. The flicker of the fire, the whisper of wind pressing through the chinking, the faint settling of logs. Living in a place like this meant your nights were full of sounds that were never quite predictable. Even silence had texture here. Take a slow breath and feel the air settle into your lungs, crisp and cool. Then you walk back toward the center of the room, letting the floorboards creak beneath you. Some planks bend slightly, making you step with more care than usual. You imagine walking across this same floor in the dark, half asleep, hoping not to stub a toe or trip over uneven boards. Many settlers learned to navigate their homes entirely by feel, using memory to guide their steps. You look once more at the bed frame and decide to check its stability. You press down on one corner and it wobbles slightly. You shift your weight, testing each side, and notice how the wooden joints respond. They hold, but there is a subtle give that makes the entire structure sway. Pioneers often fortified their beds with whatever materials they had available, adding extra braces or tying pieces together with rope. Nothing stayed perfect for long in these conditions. You sit lightly on the edge of the bed. The frame creaks under your weight, but it holds. You rest your hands on your knees and breathe slowly, letting the uneven rhythm of the cabin wrap itself around you. Even its imperfections begin to feel familiar, almost soothing. This room was built for survival, not comfort, and yet there is something undeniably peaceful about sitting within its walls, listening to the fire crackle while the cold night presses outside. You lift your head and let your gaze sweep across the space once more. The unevenness of the cabin becomes part of its charm, reminding you that the frontier life was improvised, imperfect, and always shifting. The pioneers adapted to the quirks of their homes just as they adapted to the land itself. As you sit here now, you feel yourself adjusting in the same quiet way, learning to find balance on floors that tilt, comfort in beds that creak, and calm in the gentle noises of a cabin that has weathered more winters than you can imagine. You rise slowly from the creaking bed frame and let your feet settle onto the cool floor once more. The cabin breathes around you in soft groans and faint whispers of wind. Now the drafts start to catch your attention. They brush against your ankles first, little ribbons of icy air winding their way across the floorboards as if the winter outside has found secret paths into the room. You follow the sensation, stepping lightly, tracing the chill back to its source. Soon you find yourself beside one of the log walls, where a narrow seam between two timbers lets in a faint but persistent whisper of cold. You crouch down to inspect the opening. It is thin, barely wide enough to slide a fingertip through, yet the cold that seeps from it is sharp and insistent. Early settlers understood this frustration well. Many personal journals from the period point out that even the most carefully built cabins developed gaps after a few freezes, because wood shifted constantly as moisture left the logs. By the deep months of winter, families were often patching cracks every few days, trying to keep the night air from stealing away whatever little warmth they had managed to build. You lean forward, brushing your hand along the seam. The air that slips through feels almost alive, creeping along your skin with a determination that makes you shiver. You look around the cabin and see more places where the logs never quite met cleanly. The corners hold tiny shadows where drafts hide. Near the window, the chinking has shrunk just enough to leave a faint line of frost. A soft rustle of wind outside pushes another cold current into the room. As you examine the cracks, a small detail from frontier folklore drifts into your mind. Some families believed that stuffing a hole with a scrap of an old garment invited good luck and kept misfortune from entering the home. It may not have been practical insulation, but the idea appeared often enough in letters and stories that you can imagine how comforting it felt. Anything that helped settlers feel a little more secure in the cold must have been welcomed eagerly. You rise and look for materials to patch the gaps. A small basket sits beside the wall, filled with bits of cloth, moss, bark shavings, and dried mud. Pioneers often kept such a basket ready throughout the winter. The job of filling cracks was endless, and children were sometimes tasked with collecting moss from tree trunks or scooping mud from creek banks before everything froze solid. You kneel and sift through the scraps, choosing a soft bunch of moss for the first repair. Its texture is springy beneath your fingers, a little damp but surprisingly warm compared to the air around you. You press the moss into the seam, pushing gently until it wedges tightly between the logs. The draft slows instantly, though not entirely. You add a pinch of mud from the basket, smoothing it along the surface, patting it lightly. The mixture sticks more easily than you expect. When it dries, it will harden into a protective seal. As you work, you begin to appreciate how much of pioneer life involved these small, steady actions performed out of habit rather than convenience. You move to another crack near the floor. This one is wider, almost large enough to see a glimmer of snow outside. You feel the air rushing through stronger here. You gather a thicker bundle of cloth scraps from the basket, pressing them into the gap. As you warm the cloth with your hands, a memory surfaces from something you once read. Several frontier families preferred using old quilt pieces for plugging wall gaps, claiming the layered cotton trapped heat better than mud alone. Whether that was truly effective or simply born from necessity is unclear. Accounts from the era do not always agree, leaving room for interpretation and imagination. You tuck the quilt scraps into the opening and seal the edges with mud, smoothing it with your thumb. The room grows noticeably calmer as the draft slows again. This act of sealing gaps feels strangely soothing. You repeat the process around the cabin, moving from one seam to the next. Tiny flecks of dirt cling to your fingertips. The smell of moss and wood shavings mixes with the smoky scent of the stove. The cabin becomes quieter with each repair. It is as though you are helping the structure brace itself for the long night. You pause at the window, where a narrow trickle of frost lines the sill. You run a finger over it, feeling the icy crystals melt beneath your touch. You press cloth into the thin space between the frame and the logs. The cold here feels sharper than anywhere else, as if the winter wind prefers this entry point. You adjust the cloth twice, making sure the seal holds. Once the major drafts are softened, you sit back on your heels and breathe deeply. The air still carries a chill, but the biting edge has dulled. You feel a little ripple of accomplishment, the same kind pioneers likely felt when they finished an evening of draft stopping. Winter did not give you much control in a place like this, but these small victories mattered. You stand and let your hands brush together, shaking loose bits of mud and moss. You walk toward the center of the room again. The warmth from the stove now spreads more evenly, no longer being stolen so quickly by the cold outside. When you inhale, the air has a softer feel. Not warm exactly, but less intrusive. The cabin is learning to hold its heat, at least for now. You wander to one last crack near the roof beams. This one is small but persistent. You climb onto the edge of a stool to reach it. As you press a pinch of moss into the narrow seam, you notice how the cabin shifts slightly under your weight. The roof groans faintly, and the logs seem to settle. You hold on to the beam until the motion ceases. For a moment you understand how fragile and strong the cabin is at the same time. You descend from the stool and take a slow walk around the room, testing the air with the back of your hand. The wind outside still presses occasionally against the walls, but it no longer finds easy entry. The space feels steadier, more secure. You feel the cabin embracing the warmth now, even if it can only manage a modest hold on it. You return to the stove and let your palms hover above its faint glow again. The air now wraps around your fingers in a gentler way. The cold is still here, but softened, managed, almost respectful. The pioneers ended many winter evenings like this, standing quietly after patching their homes, listening to the fire, and appreciating the small sense of control they managed to carve out of the harsh frontier night. You breathe slowly and let that same quiet satisfaction settle into your chest. The drafts no longer nip at your ankles, the walls hold the heat a little better, and the cabin feels more alive for the care you have given it. Now that the space is steadied, you turn your attention toward your bed, knowing the next step in your frontier night is preparing a place where you might finally rest. You turn toward the bed frame again, noticing how the dim firelight brushes its rough edges. The wooden structure looks simple, almost shy in its plainness, yet it carries the weight of every night the pioneers spent curled beneath quilts, trying to coax warmth from blankets and breath. Now you step closer and place your hands along the frame, feeling the cool grain of the timber. There is a kind of honesty in its rough build. No polish, no ornament, just lumber hammered together with steady hands after long days of work. Your gaze shifts to the mattress lying across it, if mattress is even the right word for what settlers used. Most frontier beds relied on ticks, large fabric bags stuffed with straw, dried grass, or sometimes corn husks if nothing else was available. Contemporary records make it clear that families refilled these ticks several times a year because the stuffing compressed and broke apart quickly. You can feel the unevenness just by pressing your palm into the surface. Some parts rise slightly, others sink inward, as if exhausted from centuries of use. You kneel beside the bed and lift one corner of the tick. The fabric is coarse against your fingers, the kind that scratches just a little and smells faintly of dried plants. You undo the loosely tied seam and peek inside. Straw rustles quietly, releasing an earthy scent that fills the air. A lesser-known oddity appears in some letters from the era, mentioning that a few settlers mixed dried mint or lavender with the straw to deter insects and add a touch of pleasant aroma. It was not common, but the idea lingers as you examine the stuffing. Your mattress tonight clearly lacks such fragrant additions. You gather a handful of straw, lifting it to feel its texture. It prickles your skin lightly. The pioneers accepted that small discomfort because it was still softer than the ground and far warmer. You run your fingers through the dry strands, stirring them gently. Some are brittle from age, curling at odd angles. Others still hold a faint golden sheen. You toss the handful back into the tick and begin redistributing everything inside, fluffing and shaking the bag in the same way frontier families did every evening. You straighten your back and grasp the edges of the mattress, lifting and shaking it with rhythmic motions. Each shake releases tiny flecks of dust that drift through the air like faint sparks. The process is strangely satisfying. You hear the whisper of straw sliding against itself, feel it shift and settle under your efforts. Evening after evening, pioneers relied on this simple ritual to regain a little loft in their beds, trying to smooth the lumps into something resembling comfort. When the tick feels fuller, and more evenly packed, you tie the seam closed again. You smooth your hand across the top, noticing that although the mattress is softer, it still has ridges and hollows. That was the reality of frontier bedding. It was never perfect, never plush, but it was often cherished. Many families considered a well-stuffed straw tick a small luxury. You stand and look around for the next layer. A pile of wool blankets sits on a small shelf. Their colors have faded over the years, but the texture remains thick and reassuring. You pick one up and feel the weight of it settle across your arms. Wool was one of the most valued materials in cold regions, not just for its warmth, but for its ability to retain heat even when slightly damp. You drape the blanket across the bed and spread it out carefully, smoothing the edges. Below the wool lies a patchwork quilt, frayed in places but still sturdy. You lift it gently. The scraps of fabric show glimpses of old shirts, dresses, and cloth sacks, stitched together in an irregular blend of patterns. The quilt feels softer than the wool, as though generations of hands have handled it lovingly. You lay it over the blanket, watching the layers build into something warm and inviting. In many households, quilts were made during the long winter evenings, offering both comfort and creative expression to families who had few other outlets. As you arrange the bedding, you recall something you once read in a settler's account. Some researchers suggest that bedding was placed not just for warmth, but also to create a psychological sense of refuge. The bed became a sanctuary at the end of a relentless day. The idea seems true as you stand here, adjusting the corners, imagining the relief families must have felt as they prepared this modest yet meaningful space. You kneel again and lift the edge of the bed frame, checking for sagging slats or loose joints. The wooden supports beneath the mattress groan lightly. You shift one slat back into place, then test it with your palm. It holds steady. Frontier settlers performed these tiny repairs often, usually without tools, using muscle memory and improvisation to keep their beds stable. The sound of the slats settling reminds you of the creaks that fill quiet nights, familiar to anyone who has slept in an old home. You sit on the edge of the bed to test its feel. The straw rises beneath you with a soft crunch. The warmth of the blankets mixes with the faint chill that still lingers in the room. You sense the balance between cold and heat, settling into a workable compromise. A small comfort, but an important one. Sleep came from accepting what the cabin could offer, not demanding more. You lace your fingers together and lean forward for a moment, letting your body adjust to the mattress. As you shift, a few pieces of straw poke gently at your back through the fabric. The sensation is oddly grounding. It reminds you that the pioneers lived with textures that were neither smooth nor softened by modern comforts. Their nights were full of these small prickles, and somehow they grew used to them. You rise again and examine the space beneath the bed. A faint draft still creeps along the floor, though much weaker than before. You slide a folded hide under the frame to block it a little more. Many settlers used animal pelts for insulation around their sleeping areas, placing them under or beside beds to trap warmth. You press the hide into place, feeling the soft fur against the rough wood. Instantly, the air around your ankles becomes a little calmer. You return to the top of the bed and lift one edge of the quilt, feeling its weight. Your arms sink slightly beneath it. Frontier quilts often held multiple layers of batting or old fabric, giving them surprising heft. That heaviness was more than warmth. It offered a sense of security in rooms where the wind rattled the walls and darkness seeped through every corner. As you lower the quilt back onto the mattress, you notice how the layers stack together in gentle waves. The bed looks inviting now, imperfect but warm, waiting patiently for the moment when exhaustion finally pulls you beneath the covers. You sit again and press your hand into the quilt, imagining the families who once did this same gesture each night. Children crawling in with cold feet, parents sighing as they sank into the limited warmth, elders grateful for any small comfort. You lean back slightly, letting your weight settle on the mattress. The fire crackles softly behind you. The drafts have quieted. The room holds a steady, fragile warmth. You run a hand along the quilt one last time, appreciating the texture, the stitching, the history within it. Now the bed is ready to welcome you, ready to cradle you through the long winter night, just as it once held countless frontier souls through their own struggles and hopes. You breathe slowly, preparing yourself for the next step in this quiet journey through the frozen cabin. You rise slowly from the edge of the straw tick and stretch your back, feeling the warmth of the blankets lingering faintly on your palms. The cabin's dim light shifts as you move, casting soft shadows across the piles of bedding you have just arranged. Now your attention drifts toward the next layer of warmth the pioneers relied on, the one that lay between them and the merciless winter nights. Hides, quilts, and whatever scraps of fabric families possessed were blended together into a patchwork of protection that had nothing to do with style and everything to do with survival. You lean back slightly, letting your weight settle on the mattress. The fire crackles softly behind you. The drafts have quieted. The room holds a steady, fragile warmth. You run a hand along the quilt one last time, appreciating the texture, the stitching, the history within it. The fur is coarse in some places and softer in others, a reminder that every natural material carried its own personality. You drape the hide over the foot of the bed, smoothing it along the quilt. The weight settles into place like a gentle hand pressing down, promising to keep the cold at bay. Many settlers layered furs on top of quilts rather than underneath, because the fur trapped heat more effectively when exposed to the air. You press your palm into the hide, feeling the lingering warmth left from your hands, and imagine how comforting this must have been for families during nights when the temperature dropped so low that even the breath inside the cabin crystallized against the walls. You move to the shelf where the patchwork quilts rest. The one on top shows a swirl of faded patterns, each square stitched from scraps of clothing that once had other lives. Shirts worn thin at the elbows, aprons stained from cooking, a torn dress sleeve now nestled beside a worn flannel pocket. Quilts like these were treasured items, not because of their beauty, but because of the labor woven into them. Women often stitched them during long winter evenings while children slept nearby. Some quilts took months to finish, becoming heirlooms handed down through generations. You lift the quilt gently, feeling its thickness. It is heavier than it looks, padded with layers of old cloth. As you unfold it, the fabric exhales a faint scent of smoke and wool. You spread it across the bed, letting the ends drape toward the floor. The weight of the quilt flattens the straw tick slightly, pressing it into a firmer shape. In the quiet of the cabin, the sound of fabric settling seems almost like a sigh. While you adjust the edges, your thoughts drift to a small curiosity that appears in a few frontier accounts. Several families believed that sleeping beneath a quilt, made with scraps from many different people, brought good fortune because it symbolized community and shared effort. It is not a widespread belief, but the idea lingers warmly. As you trace the worn squares, you can almost imagine the hands that once sewed them, stitching stories and history into every seam. You add another blanket, this one woven from coarse wool. Its surface feels scratchier, rough against your fingers, but it adds vital insulation. Many early settlers valued wool above nearly all other fabrics because it kept warmth even in humid or icy conditions. You lay the blanket over the quilt, pressing the layers together. The bed now resembles the kind of cocooned sleeping space that families created during the deepest cold. You pause for a moment, letting your eyes adjust again as the fire flickers gently in the stove. The bedding looks inviting now, with its layers folded neatly and the fur resting like a protective guardian along the top. But you are not finished yet. You walk toward a small wooden chest near the wall and open it. Inside are scraps of fabric, bits of old jackets, and lengths of cloth too small to make clothing but too valuable to throw away. Settlers rarely wasted anything. Every scrap had a purpose, whether for mending clothes, patching walls, or adding a sliver of warmth where it was needed. You gather a few of these pieces now, folding them into narrow strips. These will act as draft stoppers along the sides of the bed. The cold often crept up from the floor or seeped along the edges of the mattress. By tucking cloth along the perimeter, pioneers created a small but meaningful barrier. You kneel and slide the fabric into the gaps, smoothing it carefully until it seals the edges. Immediately you sense the difference. The cold no longer rushes in with the same determination. You stand again and run your hands across the full length of the bed. Each layer feels different beneath your palms. The coarse wool, the smoother quilted cotton, the deep fur. Together they form a landscape of texture and warmth. In a cabin like this, variety mattered. Every layer contributed something unique. Some trapped heat. Others shielded the body from prickling straw. Still others added weight that made the sleeper feel secure. You take a slow breath and imagine yourself lying beneath all these blankets on a winter night. The fire crackling faintly, the wind nudging the walls, the warmth from the layered bedding wrapping around you. Sleep must have come slowly sometimes, with the cold persisting in little pockets despite all efforts. Some early households even placed warmed stones or bricks at the foot of the bed, wrapped in cloth so they would not burn the quilts. That small trick could mean the difference between a night of shivering and a night of tolerable warmth. Of course, there is still curiosity among researchers about how effective these layered combinations truly were. Some specialists believe that the mix of hides, quilts, and straw beds provided surprisingly strong insulation when arranged thoughtfully. Others insist that frontier families endured constant discomfort despite all their efforts. With so many variables at play, from climate to construction to available materials, no single answer satisfies every observer. But standing here in the flicker of firelight, you sense that these layers offered at least a modest refuge from the cold. You take a moment to sit on the bed again. This time the mattress feels slightly softer, its straw freshly fluffed. The quilt settles comfortably beneath you. The fur warms quickly under your hand. You inhale deeply, absorbing the scents of wool, straw, and smoke. These smells once accompanied countless families through their nights. They are humble scents, yet strangely soothing, like memories preserved in fabric. You lie back just for a moment, testing the full warmth of the bedding. The layers press lightly against you, weighting your body in a reassuring way. The warmth is uneven but real, building gradually as the quilts adjust to your presence. You close your eyes for a heartbeat and imagine a frontier child curling up beside a sibling under similar layers, whispering stories before drifting off. You picture parents easing into this same bed after a day of bone-deep exhaustion, grateful for even the slightest comfort. You exhale and sit upright again. The bedding feels ready now, prepared to hold whatever heat your body can produce. You smooth the quilt one final time, noticing how the fire's glow deepens the colors of the worn fabric. No modern mattress could replicate this blend of texture, history, and effort. Every stitch, every hide, every layer carries evidence of hands that worked to create warmth in a world determined to take it away. The bed stands quietly before you now, complete and waiting, a small island of comfort in a cabin shaped by cold and perseverance. With the bedding arranged, the night begins to feel closer, deeper, and more intimate. You feel the story drawing you toward the next part of your evening, where the glow of the stove and the shadows of the walls will guide you deeper into the frontier night. You stand beside the bed for a quiet moment, letting the layered warmth settle visually into the room as the fire behind you hums in a low, steady rhythm. The shadows stretch long and soft across the floor, flickering with each breath of air that stirs inside the stove. Now your attention drifts naturally toward the way the glow fills the cabin. The light feels alive, never still, never predictable, and you understand why frontier families treated the fire as a kind of companion during winter nights. It shaped their sleep, guided their evenings, and painted the cabin walls with a gentle, wavering gold. You take a slow step toward the stove again, noticing how the brightness deepens as you approach. The iron door breathes warm pulses into the room, each one carrying the scent of burning pine and faint resin. One recorded observation from settlers notes that winter evenings were measured less by the clock and more by the life of the flames. When the fire flared bright, families mended clothes, read by lamplight, or whispered stories. When it began to dim, the cabin sank into a quiet rhythm that invited sleep. You crouch low, resting your hands on your knees, and peer through the vent where the fire dances. The flames coil and twist, turning the inside of the stove into a bright, pulsing cavern. Sparks climb the air in tiny leaps before fading into red embers. Every now and then a log shifts with a soft thunk, and the shadows in the room change shape. You watch them climb the walls, crawling up the beams and stretching across the ceiling like drifting spirits. They make the cabin feel larger, as though the flickering light creates extra space that did not exist moments before. As you stand again, a stray spark inside the stove pops sharply. The sound startles you just a little. A small curiosity noted in a handful of frontier letters describes how children used to stare at these sparks and predict the next pop like a game. Some believed that each spark signaled a visitor or hinted at weather changes. It was harmless folklore, a playful distraction in long winters. You imagine a child sitting cross-legged beside the stove, eyes wide, waiting for the next tiny explosion of ember. You walk slowly across the room, observing how the firelight slides along the quilted bedding. The colors shift gently beneath its glow, turning dull blues into warm purples and faded reds into soft oranges. The effect is soothing. Even the rough straw mattress looks welcoming in this shifting light. You trace your hand lightly along the quilt surface. The warmth from the stove cannot reach every corner of the bed, but the glow brings a sense of comfort that warmth alone cannot offer. You take a seat on the small stool near the table, where the candle from earlier still rests. The candle is unlit, but the firelight from the stove provides more illumination than you expect. It casts a soft halo across the table. Catching on the tin cup, the rough wooden plate, and the few scattered tools. You watch the shadows of these objects stretch long across the surface, as if reaching for something just out of sight. Your eyes wander up to the rafters. The beams overhead are unvarnished and uneven, but the shadows give them a kind of quiet dignity. The shifting darkness makes them look older, wiser, almost sentinel-like. You imagine the pioneers lying in bed at night, staring up at these same beams as they listen to the wind outside. Some family letters mention that during especially cold nights, people sat up just to watch the flame's reflection tremble across the ceiling. It was a way to calm the mind, a rhythm to breathe with. You turn back toward the stove once more, realizing the fire has begun to settle into a steady burn. The embers glow a deep orange, and the flames have softened into gentle waves. That slow, hypnotic dance seems to guide your breathing toward an easier pace. Another interesting note, preserved in some early household guides, mentions that families often tried to time their bedtime with the stove's rhythm. If the fire was bright, they worked a little longer. If it dimmed, they let the night come naturally. You inhale deeply, letting the warm air fill your lungs before releasing it into the cool space beyond. The room feels calmer now. The drafts are muted. The bedding is ready. The fire has chosen its steady rhythm. You walk a slow circle around the room, watching how the shadows change with each step you take. They stretch, shrink, and slide along the logs like painted figures. The atmosphere feels almost theatrical, as though the flickering light turns the cabin into a stage for nightly rituals. You pause at the window. The frost there glows faintly under the fire's reflection, creating patterns that look like delicate feathers etched in ice. You run your fingers across the glass and leave a brief foggy print that fades almost instantly. Through the frosted blur outside, the world appears quiet and distant. The fire behind you casts a soft warmth against your back, creating a thin barrier between you and the winter beyond. Turning again, you notice how the firelight glints on the iron hinges of the door. The warm glow softens their harsh metal shapes, turning them into amber reflections. You listen to the stove's low hum and the faint crackle of wood settling deeper into embers. These sounds create a soft cadence that draws the entire room together into a single, peaceful moment. You take a seat on the stool once more, and as you rest your hands on your lap, a thought drifts gently through your mind. Specialists who study domestic life in frontier regions often remark that firelight served as both illumination and emotional anchor. It helped people feel grounded when storms raged outside. It softened the edges of fear. It made the night feel just a little less cold. You feel that truth now. The fire's glow holds the cabin in a warm embrace, even if the warmth is faint. The shadows sway in slow, soothing patterns. The quiet deepens in a comforting way, and the story of this night continues to unfold around you, moving toward the hours when sleep waits patiently in the dim glow of the frontier cabin. You remain seated for a moment longer, letting the gentle crackle of the fire settle into your ears until it becomes part of the cabin's natural rhythm. Then you rise and walk slowly toward the center of the room. noticing how the air shifts again as you leave the warm halo around the stove. The farther you move, the more the silence expands. It is a thick, weighty quiet, the kind that rests on your shoulders. Frontier families knew this kind of stillness well. Many early settlers wrote about how nighttime wrapped the cabin in a deep hush that felt both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. You stand there, listening. At first, the quiet seems total, but the longer you hold still, the more subtle sounds begin to reveal themselves. The faint groan of a log adjusting under the pressure of cold, the soft whistle of wind slipping across the chinking in tiny breaths, the distant murmur of trees shifting outside, their frozen branches scraping gently against one another. You close your eyes briefly and sense the world beyond the walls. It is vast and silent, yet full of small hidden movements. You take a slow step toward the far wall. The floorboards creak beneath your foot, a muted complaint that echoes through the cabin. That single sound feels almost loud in the quiet. In many pioneer diaries, people described how nighttime magnified every noise, turning humble cabins into amphitheaters of creaks and whispers. Even the smallest shift could feel significant when the rest of the world sat frozen in place. You continue listening. The wind rises slightly outside, lifting loose snow across the ground. A soft brushing sound presses against the exterior logs. You imagine how settlers often lay awake, trying to distinguish between the harmless scrape of wind-driven snow and the heavier sound of an animal moving near the walls. Calm nights offered rest, but they also brought uncertainty. Silence was not always comforting out here. Sometimes it felt like the land holding its breath. You step toward the window and peer out through the frosted glass. The darkness is deep enough that shapes blur into one another. A faint silver glint from the moon reflects off the snowy ground, but otherwise the world looks still. The cold outside muffles everything, swallowing distant noises, and leaving behind a quiet so complete that your heartbeat feels louder than the wind. You breathe softly, letting your breath fog the glass in a spreading oval. You turn away from the window and notice how the silence sharpens your awareness of the cabin itself. The stove pops again, a short, crisp sound. You hear the gentle sigh of fabric as the quilts settle. Even your own steps sound different, softer now, as though the wood beneath your feet has grown cautious in the night. One account from a frontier homestead notes that during winter, sound carried strangely inside these cabins, creating a sense that the building spoke in small, secret conversations. You move to the table and run your fingers along its edge. The wood is cool, and the faint ridges catch your skin. The quiet makes you slow your movements automatically, afraid to disturb the fragile calm. You sit on the stool again and let your hands rest on your knees. A thoughtful detail from pioneer letters mentions how people often measured their comfort at night not by warmth, but by how much the silence allowed them to relax. When the wind was loud or the trees snapped under frost, sleep was hard to find. When the world grew still, they settled more easily, even if the cold persisted. Tonight, the silence feels somewhere in the middle, not entirely calm, not particularly threatening, just present. A gentle companion. You listen another moment and hear the faintest tapping noise overhead. It takes you a few seconds to identify it. A small patch of melting frost dripping slowly from the roof, landing on a beam before falling again to the ground outside. You would miss it entirely if you were not paying attention. The sound fades quickly, absorbed into the deeper stillness. You rise and walk toward the door. The cold edges of the frame greet you instantly. You place your ear near the wood and listen. Outside, the wind comes and goes in shallow breaths. Its voice is softer now, more like a sigh than a whistle. You imagine the vast forest stretching in every direction, blanketed in snow that dampens all sound. Trees stand like frozen sentinels, animals curl into burrows, and even the rivers hide beneath thick sheets of ice. In a place like this, night does not just fall, it settles, claiming everything in its quiet grip. Tonight, the silence feels somewhere in the middle, not entirely calm, not particularly threatening, just present. A gentle companion. You listen another moment and hear the faintest tapping noise overhead. It takes you a few seconds to identify it. A small patch of melting frost dripping slowly from the roof, landing on a beam before falling again to the ground outside. You would miss it entirely if you were not paying attention. The sound fades quickly, absorbed into the deeper stillness. You return to the stove, feeling the warmth greet you again. The fire's soft glow seems to push back the quiet just a little, creating a comfortable pocket of sound around the dancing flames. You kneel and rest your hand lightly on the iron surface, careful not to touch the hottest part. The heat vibrates gently under your palm, grounding you. The room feels safer here, closer to the warmth, closer to the steady rhythm of crackling wood. You sit near the stove and gaze once more at the shifting shadows. They move like slow waves on a dark ocean, rising and falling with the fire's breath. Even in stillness, the room holds life. You sense the quiet settling deeper into your body, softening your muscles and easing the tension from your shoulders. Then, as if on cue, the cabin sighs again, a faint groan from the roof, a whisper of wind, a creak from the bed frame. All small reminders that silence is never absolute in a place built from living materials. Logs settle, quilts shift, embers breathe. The quiet becomes a gentle symphony, one that the pioneers knew well, a lullaby composed of wood, wind, and flame. You inhale slowly, allowing your breath to blend with the sounds of the cabin. The silence no longer feels empty, it feels restful, protective, encouraging you to ease deeper into the night and into the unfolding story of how these settlers found restful sleep amid cold, quiet, and the ever-present whisper of the wilderness. You stay seated in the warm glow for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the calm of the cabin settle deeper into you. Then your thoughts drift naturally to the bed once more, not the structure itself, but the way people used it. On the frontier, sleep was rarely a solitary experience. Families shared beds out of necessity and instinct, relying on one another's body heat to survive the coldest nights. You stand and move toward the mattress, brushing your hand over the quilt as if imagining the weight of several bodies shifting beneath it. You sit gently on the edge again, and the straw inside the tick rustles in a soft crackle. It makes you imagine the sound multiplied by 2, or 3, or 6, depending on the size of the pioneer family. Letters from early homesteads often describe entire households sleeping side by side, packed together like spoons in a drawer. Not out of preference, but because warmth was a shared resource. The combined heat of several people could turn a freezing bed into something survivable. You press your palm into the quilt and imagine the warmth that would build when bodies curled close without hesitation. You lean back slightly, letting the thought settle. It was not unusual for parents to sleep at one end of the bed and children at the other, feet toward faces, forming a human chain of heat. In some households, the youngest slept in the middle, so they remained warmest. These arrangements might seem crowded now, but to frontier families they felt practical and often comforting. A small affectionate detail preserved in a family journal mentions a child falling asleep to the rhythm of a parent's breathing, lulled more by that sound than by the fire crackling in the corner. You lift the corner of the quilt, imagining how several hands once tugged at it from different directions. Every shift of fabric must have been a negotiation. If someone moved too much, the cold snuck in through the open gap, and everyone woke shivering. Families joked about this in their writing, teasing siblings who kicked or rolled too far. Sleep was a shared journey, and everyone had to do their part to maintain the fragile cocoon of warmth. You stretch out your hand, letting it hover just above the quilted surface. The air here is cooler than closer to the stove, and you feel again why settlers shared beds. A single sleeper lost heat too quickly in these cabins, even with the thickest quilts. One early traveler's account remarks that sleeping alone in winter felt like trying to warm an entire room with a candle. You sense the truth in that comparison now. The cold is patient and persistent, always ready to slip back over the bed the moment the fire dims. You rise and walk slowly around the bed, observing how the shadows gather along its edges. You imagine the different forms that once occupied it. Children curled in tight balls beneath quilts. A mother settling in with a sigh of relief after a day of endless work. A father rising in the middle of the night to check the fire, slipping back beneath the covers with an armful of warmth borrowed from the stove. Some families even kept infants in small hanging cradles beside the bed so they could reach out at night to soothe a fussing child without rising fully into the cold. You sit again, this time on the far corner of the bed frame. The wood creaks, echoing lightly around the room. You think about how common this sound must have been each night as family members climbed in, jostling for space. In the silence of a frontier night, that simple creak signaled the beginning of rest. You close your eyes briefly and imagine bodies settling, blankets being pulled up, warmth building slowly under layers of wool and fur. Maybe a whispered goodnight exchanged before exhaustion pulled everyone under. A curious little detail from some frontier households describes how sharing a bed sometimes led to whispered stories or quiet songs, especially on the coldest nights when sleep came slowly. Children might ask for tales of warm summers, or parents might hum softly to calm their restless hearts. These moments created a sense of togetherness that balanced the hardships of daily life. You can almost hear those murmurs now, imagined voices weaving through the flickering firelight. You open your eyes and glance at the wall where the shadows sway gently. The cabin feels more intimate when you picture the bed full, the warmth of bodies, the steady breathing of people who relied on one another, the soft rustle of blankets adjusting, even the faint snores that would drift through the room. Some specialists in frontier domestic life point out that these shared sleeping arrangements shaped family bonds in subtle but lasting ways. The closeness built trust, understanding, and resilience, all of which were vital in isolating and unpredictable environments. You stand again and move toward the stove, then turn back to look at the bed from across the room. From here, you see it differently, like a small island of warmth in a vast, cold landscape. You imagine approaching it after a day spent outside in freezing temperatures, your hands numb, your feet stiff, your breath shallow. The thought of slipping beneath the covers alongside loved ones must have been one of the few comforts winter nights could offer. You open your eyes and glance at the wall where the shadows sway gently. The cabin feels more intimate when you picture the bed full, the warmth of bodies, the steady breathing of people who relied on one another, the soft rustle of blankets adjusting, even the faint snores that would drift through the room. Some specialists in frontier domestic life point out that these shared sleeping arrangements shaped family bonds in subtle but lasting ways. A curious little detail from some frontier households describes how sharing a bed sometimes led to whispered stories or quiet songs, especially on the coldest nights when sleep came slowly. Children might ask for tales of warm summers, or parents might hum softly to calm their restless hearts. These moments created a sense of togetherness that balanced the hardships of daily life. You can almost hear those murmurs now, imagined voices weaving through the flickering firelight. You walk a slow circle around the bed, letting the stillness deepen your sense of what this space meant. Even the imperfections of the mattress feel softer when viewed through the lens of shared survival. A lumpy straw tick mattered less when several bodies pressed together, smoothing the bumps through compressed weight. The blankets held not only warmth, but history, each layer added over time as families grew or fabrics wore thin. You take one last breath before stepping away. The bed, now layered and ready, seems to hold the memory of countless nights spent shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. Tonight, you sense yourself becoming part of that long tradition, preparing to slip beneath the covers and join the quiet company of those who found warmth through shared rest. You return to the bedside and rest your hand once more on the fur at the foot of the bed. The texture is thick beneath your fingers. You imagine a child reaching for this same spot at night, seeking comfort from its familiar feel. Families depended on touch as reassurance in the dark, long before insulated walls or electric lights existed. Every shift of the bed, Every brush of a hand carried meaning. You lift the undergarment nearest the stove. The warmth has seeped into the fibers, making it more pliable. Some families slept in whatever they wore during the day simply because removing layers meant losing precious heat. But many accounts from the time reveal that settlers preferred specific sleep garments when they had enough resources. One detailed note from an early homestead inventory mentions long woolen nightshirts worn by men, often reaching nearly to the knees. Women sometimes wore similar long shifts, sturdy and entirely practical, designed to trap warmth against the skin. You hold the garment closer to your body, letting the fabric brush lightly across your hand. It feels coarse, a reminder that frontier textiles were rarely soft unless they were heavily worn. Fine fabric existed, of course, but only wealthier settlers could afford it. Most families used simple wool or linen because they were durable and forgiving in harsh weather. You slip one arm into the sleeve and feel the warmth gathering slowly around your skin. The fabric scratches slightly, but not unpleasantly. It feels honest, built to last. As you dress, you recall a curious detail mentioned in a few scattered journals. Some pioneers believed that wearing a cap or hood to bed kept away nightmares, not because of superstition, but because cold air on the scalp could make sleep restless. Whether this belief began as practicality or imagination, no one can say for certain, but a warm nightcap does sound appealing in a room where you can still see your own breath. You reach into the drying rack and lift a small cloth cap, tugging it gently over your head. Instantly, the chill along your scalp fades. You turn slowly, feeling the fabric shift across your shoulders. You tug the hem of the nightshirt into place and let it fall lightly against your legs. The wool holds warmth surprisingly well, forming a protective layer between you and the cold that pools along the floor. A short step forward makes the floorboards creak beneath you, and you feel grateful for this newly gained insulation. Without it, every breath of cold air would tighten your muscles. You walk toward the window where the frost still clings to the frame in feathered patterns. You touch the glass lightly. The cold sinks instantly into your fingertips, reminding you why sleepwear mattered so much. Some families supplemented their nightclothes with extra scarves, layers wrapped around the neck and shoulders. One settler's note mentions sleeping with mittens on, especially when the fire struggled to last through the night. You bring your hands to your chest and imagine slipping wool mittens between the quilts to preserve warmth. You turn back toward the center of the cabin, letting the soft sway of your nightshirt guide your steps. It feels peculiar at first, so different from modern sleepwear. The material is heavier, the cut broader, the sleeves long and unshaped, but the more you move, the more it seems to belong here. The garment shifts with the firelight, casting gentle shadows as you cross the room. This simple attire becomes another layer of protection, another barrier between you and the winter pressing at the walls. A cluster of wrapped rags sits on the table. You unfold one to reveal a pair of thick, hand-stitched socks. They are mismatched and worn thin in some places, but the wool still holds strength. Settlers treasured socks like these, often mending them repeatedly until fabric gave way. You slip them on and feel the texture mold to your feet. The warmth blooms slowly, making your ankles tingle. These socks would have been reserved specifically for sleeping, never worn outside where snow would soak them. As you straighten, your thoughts drift again to the scholars who study daily life in frontier regions. Some point out that clothing choices at night reflected not just practicality but social habits. Families often changed into nightwear together, valuing modesty even in cramped cabins. Others note that the practice varied. Some households lived so close to hardship that distinctions between day and night clothing blurred entirely. Whatever the case, the garments you wear now feel like a merging of necessity and ritual, an acknowledgement that sleep required preparation in a world this cold. You move toward the stove to check your drying coat and shirt. They still hold a faint dampness at the seams, which makes you grateful for the warm nightclothes wrapped around you. The stove crackles softly, offering its last strong burst of heat before settling into a slow burn. The fire's glow reflects off your wool sleeves, highlighting the rough weave. You smooth your hand along the fabric, feeling how tightly the fibers cling together. This garment has one purpose: keep you alive through the night. You take a slow walk around the room, letting your body adjust to the feel of your sleepwear. It moves differently than your daytime clothing, looser and quieter, as though encouraging you toward rest. The air brushes along the hem as you step, but the warmth remains sealed inside. You pause beside the bed and inhale the scents around you: wool, straw, lightly steaming fabric, and the subtle smoky breath of the cabin walls. Then you lift the corner of the fur and run your hand underneath, testing the warmth beneath the layers. The nightshirt shields you well, but the combination of quilts, hides, and wool clothing promises a deeper comfort. You sit on the edge again and feel the softness gather around your legs. The firelight flickers across the surface of the bed, turning the quilt's patched colors into gentle waves of gold and red. You close your eyes briefly, savoring the way the nightclothes hold warmth around your body. You imagine the pioneers settling into their own sleep garments, listening to the wind outside, whispering a final good night as the cabin darkened. The simple act of dressing for bed becomes a quiet ritual, a declaration that despite the cold, despite the uncertainty, sleep is possible. You take one more deep breath and rise again, ready to continue preparing your space, wrapped warmly now in the same layers that helped frontier families find rest in the heart of winter. You stand near the bed, wrapped in your warm nightclothes, and listen again to the quiet hum of the cabin. The fire has softened into a calmer glow, but the world outside seems to gather its energy in the deepening night. Something subtle shifts in the air, a faint tremor that runs through the logs of the cabin and settles along the rafters. You walk slowly toward the window, the firelight trailing behind you, and rest your hand on the frosted sill. Beyond the glass, the night stares back at you, vast, pale, and strangely alert. This is the hour when pioneers often lay awake listening for whatever might move in the darkness. You lean closer to the pane, straining gently to hear the first hints of sound. At first the night seems silent. Then, gradually, you pick out faint rhythms: the wind brushing along the frozen branches, the distant groan of ice shifting on the ground, and something softer, a far-away rustle that might be an animal navigating through the drifts. Many settlers wrote about the discomfort of lying in bed during winter nights, listening to noises they could not easily identify. The smallest rustle could inspire caution, and the faintest howl could thread unease through a cabin not yet fully warmed. You draw back slightly from the window and let your breath steady. The glass gathers frost around the edges again, hiding the outside world in a curtain of pale white. You imagine how isolating this must have felt for frontier families. The cabin walls were thin, the windows fragile, the fire unpredictable. There was no electricity, no hum of modern life to drown out the wilderness. Nights belonged to whatever creatures wandered through the trees. In the stillness, those sounds often became more dramatic in the mind than they truly were. You move slowly to the center of the room and stand still, your head tilted slightly to catch the next sound. A faint creaking echoes down from the roof beams, so soft you almost miss it. Perhaps it is the wood adjusting to the cold. Perhaps it is snow sliding gently across the roof. You remind yourself that these sounds are normal, part of the cabin's nightly conversation. They were familiar to the settlers who slept here long before you, and they likely comforted them in a strange way. They knew their homes well enough to know which sounds meant danger, and which were simply the building settling into the night. A thoughtful note from early frontier writings mentions that families sometimes used sound as a guide to weather changes. A long, low groan in the logs often meant more pressure in the air, signaling incoming snow or colder temperatures. A sharp crack in the distance could mean a tree breaking under frost. You listen carefully now, wondering if you too can sense the shift in the wind's voice. It whistles faintly for a moment, then dips low, like a sigh passing through the dark. In the distance you hear another sound, a long, mournful cry that rises and fades again. It is faint, stretched thin across the cold night, but unmistakable. The voice of a wolf. You feel the hair on your arms lift slightly, even beneath the wool. In the frontier, wolves were often heard far more than seen. They travelled in packs, their calls echoing across valleys and forests long before they reached any cabin. Settlers grew used to the sound, though it rarely lost its ability to stir the imagination. You listen as the call lingers a moment, then fades into the hush of snow-laden trees. You walk closer to the door and rest your hand lightly against the frame, feeling the faint tremble of wind pushing at it. That howl was distant, not a threat, just part of the night's chorus. But to families living in isolated homesteads, those cries could tug at their nerves. They knew wolves rarely approached cabins, yet the thought of them lurking somewhere in the darkness stirred primal instincts. You take a slow breath, grounding yourself, and turn back toward the stove. The fire crackles with a gentle pop, a sound so comforting it feels like a whispered reassurance. You kneel beside the stove and rest your hand on the warm floor, letting the heat soak up into your palm. It steadies you. The wolves belong to the woods, not to the cabin. You remind yourself that many frontier families viewed night sounds not with fear, but with a kind of respect. The wilderness spoke in its own language, and hearing it meant you were part of the world, not separate from it. You rise again and step toward the bed, the sound of rustling straw beneath your feet echoing lightly across the room. You sit on the edge of the quilt and listen once more. The night seems to shift again. The wind returns in slow, steady breaths. A tree branch outside scratches lightly against the wall, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap that makes you imagine long fingers brushing against the logs. You know it is only a branch, but the sound carries a strange intimacy in the darkness. You lie back for a moment on the quilts, fully clothed in your warm nightshirt, and let your head sink into the pillow. You stare up at the beams overhead, watching the firelight ripple across their rough surfaces. In this dim glow, you realize how many settlers spent these moments whispering quiet thoughts into the dark. One traveler's account notes that people often spoke softly to themselves or prayed as they lay listening to the sounds around them. The night invited contemplation, especially when sleep did not come easily. You close your eyes and focus on your breathing. The cabin creaks again, a shifting of weight in the timbers. Another distant howl floats across the night, softer this time, fading quickly. The rhythmic pulse of wind brushing against the chinking follows. Your breathing slows even more, becoming part of the soundscape. It is easy to imagine how frontier families eventually drifted into sleep through this slow process of listening and adjusting. The night sounds became a cradle rocking them gently. You open your eyes again and sit up. You walk quietly toward the far corner of the cabin where the shadows are deepest. You stand there, allowing your senses to stretch outward. The dark seems to pulse in slow waves. The faint scent of smoke mixes with the cold air that lingers near the floor. You let the sensations flow through you, grounding yourself in the reality of this place. Some researchers who study nighttime experiences of pioneer families suggest that their relationship with sound was far more intimate than ours. In modern life, noise surrounds us constantly, dulling our senses. Out here, sounds mattered. They carried information, comfort, or warning. The ability to interpret them was an important part of survival. You try to listen now with that same attentive stillness. A soft rustling whispers from beneath the cabin, perhaps a small animal stirring in its burrow. A gentle tapping comes from the roof again. Another sigh from the wind. Nothing urgent, nothing dangerous, just the night speaking to itself. You step back toward the fire and place one more piece of wood into the stove. The flame accepts it with a quiet flicker. The light grows slightly, warming the corners where shadows had gathered. You sit on the stool once more, letting the glow wrap around you like a blanket. The night continues its slow conversation outside, blending whispers of wind with distant animal calls. And as you listen, you begin to understand how the pioneers found rest here. Not by shutting out the night, but by letting its sounds guide them gently into sleep. You remain seated near the soft glow of the stove, letting the last echoes of the distant wolf call fade gently from your awareness. The hush that follows feels thicker now, like a blanket slowly settling over the cabin. You rise from the stool and move toward the bed again, your steps quiet on the uneven floorboards. The quilts sway slightly as you brush your hand across them. Now, as the night deepens, your thoughts begin to drift toward what sleep actually felt like for the pioneers. Not just the physical struggle with cold and discomfort, but the inner world that waited for them once their eyes finally closed. Dreams came differently in a place like this. You sit on the edge of the mattress and let the straw tick shift beneath you. The sound is soft, an almost grassy whisper, reminding you that this bed once belonged to people who lived in rhythm with nature far more closely than anyone does today. You stretch your legs and slide your fingers beneath the top quilt, feeling the layers slowly warm beneath your touch. As the warmth spreads, your mind wanders into the intimate, nightly landscape of pioneer dreams. You lower yourself onto the quilt and lie back, staring at the ceiling beams. In this quiet posture, it becomes easy to imagine how frontier people drifted into sleep. Their days were exhausting, relentless work, bitter cold, and constant vigilance. So when their heads met the pillow, dreams often felt like a strange mixture of longing and memory. A number of surviving letters describe how people dreamed of summer fields during the harshest winter nights. Lush grass, warm earth, sunny skies. Not just the physical struggle with cold and discomfort, but the inner world that waited for them once their eyes finally closed. Dreams came differently in a place like this. These dreams offered emotional refuge. You inhale softly and imagine that warmth filling your chest. You feel that weight now as you lie beneath the quilts, imagining the lingering stresses that shaped their nights. You roll onto your side and rest your cheek against the pillow. The faint scent of straw drifts upward. The distant creak of wood settles into a comforting rhythm. Suddenly the room feels smaller, cozier, as if drawing you into a deep state of reflection. The fire crackles softly, and the flickering glow dances faintly along the quilt's surface. You imagine a pioneer child lying here, their mind full of impressions from the day, hauling water, helping mend a fence, listening to parents talk in low tones about the weather turning colder. In their dreams, these impressions might swirl together in strange, shifting scenes. You close your eyes for a moment and picture those scenes. In your mind, the forest looms tall and shadowed. Snow crunches underfoot. A soft voice calls from somewhere indistinct. Dreams in this environment were shaped by powerful sensory experiences. Families living in the wilderness often dreamed of the woods, of hunting trails, of storms moving across the land. Some even recorded moments where dreams felt so vivid that waking took a few seconds longer, as if the mind needed to climb out of a deep, cold pool. You open your eyes again, letting them adjust to the warm glow of the stove. Shadows slide gently along the rafters. You take a deep breath, and as the air fills your lungs, you recall another intriguing detail from early frontier writings. Some families believed dreams could offer guidance, not in a mystical sense, but as reflections of the subconscious. If a man dreamed his fire went out, he often rose to check it quietly, just in case. If a woman dreamed of knocking at the door, she sometimes assumed the wind had shifted and went to reinforce a drafty wall. In this way, dreams gently shaped nightly routines. You sit up again, folding your legs beneath you. The quilt settles around your waist, warm and heavy. You imagine how it must have felt for settlers to wake suddenly from a vivid dream, disoriented in the dark, listening for any sounds that hinted at danger. A tree snapping in the cold might jolt someone awake, and for a few seconds the lines between dream and reality blurred. You lean forward, elbows on your knees, feeling that same boundary soften around you as the cabin creaks in the quiet. You reach out and run your hand along the quilt once more, then slowly lie back, letting your mind roam further. Some researchers who study sleep patterns in historical environments suggest that the pioneers may have experienced segmented sleep. They might drift into an early period of slumber, wake naturally for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then return to bed for a second round of rest. In that quiet middle period, people often turn to prayer, reflection, or conversation. The stillness provided space to examine dreams or talk softly by firelight. You picture that now, a settler waking after a few hours, rubbing their eyes, then gently stirring the stove to add a small log, perhaps murmuring to a partner about a strange dream, perhaps glancing out the window to check the weather. The cabin would glow faintly as embers revived, and then the world would fall quiet again as everyone slipped back beneath the quilts. You tilt your head, imagining the soft rustle of blankets and the faint exhale of a sleeping child. Rolling gently onto your stomach, you rest your head on folded arms. The firelight softens your vision at the edges. You trace a small pattern on the quilt with your fingertip. Dreams in the frontier world were not escapist fantasies. They were extensions of daily life, molded by fear, hope, memory, and imagination. A weary mother might dream of her childhood home. A father might dream of planting in spring, long before the ground thawed. A child might dream of animals they had never seen but imagined from stories. These visions offered respite and sometimes gentle encouragement. You let yourself drift deeper into the atmosphere of the cabin. The whisper of wind outside blends with the breathing of the room. You feel the softness of the quilt under your cheek. You imagine drifting into sleep here, in a space where the line between the real world and the dream world thins. Your mind would likely fill with scenes of flickering firelight, bending trees, the scent of pine and smoke, and the warmth of shared blankets. Dreams shaped by simplicity, hardship, and the profound closeness of living in a small wooden structure surrounded by the endless winter. You sit up once more and swing your legs gently over the side of the bed. The floor greets your bare feet with a cool kiss. You stand, drawing in a slow breath, letting the dreamy haze lift a little. The night continues outside, alive with faint noises and shifting winds, and you realize how deeply those sounds must have woven themselves into the dreams of those who once slept here. The boundary between the waking cabin and the world within their minds was thin, almost fluid. You take a few slow steps toward the stove. The fire glows steady now, spreading warmth across the room. You rest your hand on the iron surface for a moment, grounding yourself again in the present. The dreams of the frontier were not yours, but for a moment they brushed against you, offering a glimpse of the inner life of those who slipped into sleep after days shaped by cold and labor. You turn away from the stove, steady and warm, ready to continue moving deeper into the night that unfolds in this quiet, frozen cabin. You walk quietly across the floor, feeling the cool boards flex slightly under your wool-covered feet. The cabin seems calmer now, its shadows drifting lazily along the walls as the fire settles into a deep, steady glow. You let your fingers trail along the edge of the table, then move toward the stove once more. Something tugs at your thoughts, a reminder carried in the crackle of the embers. Sleep on the frontier was never as simple as lying down and drifting off. Nights were punctuated by small, necessary interruptions, and the most common of these was tending the fire when the flames fell too low. You kneel in front of the stove, resting one hand lightly on the warm iron. Families knew that letting the fire die entirely could be dangerous, not just inconvenient, but truly perilous. Many personal accounts from the period mention waking in the middle of the night, gasping from the cold, scrambling to coax life back into the stove before frost crept too deep into the cabin. You lift the lid gently now and peer inside. The glow is soft, but the fire is still alive. Embers pulse like tiny red hearts buried under the wood. You stir them lightly with the iron poker, watching sparks rise and fade in the darkened interior. You add a small stick, careful not to overload the stove. A thoughtful detail from early housekeeping guides suggests that during winter nights, settlers used thinner pieces of wood so they could catch fire faster and provide a brief flare of warmth without overheating the cabin. You place the stick slowly and close the lid, listening as the flame stirs to life and the stove begins to breathe again. You rise and stretch your back, feeling the slight ache that comes from bending over a warm stove in a cold room. You think about how many times parents did exactly this through the long winter months. They would slip from bed quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and pass across the floor in near darkness. Often the only light came from the faint red glow inside the stove or the pale moon filtering through frosted windows. Those midnight moments became a familiar ritual, a small but constant part of surviving the cold. You walk toward the bed again and sit gently on the edge. The quilts welcome you with a mixture of warmth and weight. You draw one hand along the fur at the foot of the bed and imagine someone waking beside you with a shiver, nudging you to check the fire. Maybe not in irritation, but with weary acceptance. A few families even assigned nightly fire duty, rotating turns so each person had a chance to rest longer. The fire had its own schedule, and everyone was bound to it. You lie back briefly and let your eyes half close, feeling the room around you. The stove pops again, sending a fleck of heat into the quiet. The quilts are warm from your earlier rest, and the softness of the straw beneath you shifts gently with your weight. For a moment, you let yourself imagine drifting into sleep, but the cabin does not allow you to sink too deeply. Even as you melt into the warmth, the night reminds you that more work waits. Something faint catches your ear, a tiny whistle of wind slipping near the roofline. You open your eyes and listen. The sound is harmless, but enough to remind you how fragile warmth can be. Many settlers woke from their first round of sleep, not because the fire called them, but because nature did. A shifting breeze, a subtle cold spot, a creaking beam. These small things nudged them awake, pulling them back into the rhythm of tending, checking, adjusting. You sit up once more and walk toward the window. The frost there has deepened into intricate patterns, curling like feathery vines across the glass. Your reflection looks blurry, softened by the pale ice. Beyond the window, the world remains still. The moonlight brushes the snow with a muted glow. You watch it for a moment, understanding how stepping away from the warm bed into a cold room must have been both irritating and inevitable. Tending the cabin at night was not optional. It was part of surviving. You turn back and scan the cabin with a practical eye. You touch the wall near the bed, checking for new drafts. You run your hand along the floor to ensure no cold wind slips beneath the frame. These gestures mirror the nightly routines of countless frontier families. Some would check the door latch, others would listen carefully to the outside for signs of a storm. Those who kept livestock near the cabin sometimes stepped outside for a moment to make sure everything was safe. Every night contained small, unpredictable chores. You sit up once more and walk toward the window. The frost there has deepened into intricate patterns, curling like feathery vines across the glass. Your reflection looks blurry, softened by the pale ice. Beyond the window, the world remains still. The moonlight brushes the snow with a muted glow. You watch it for a moment, understanding how stepping away from the warm bed into a cold room must have been both irritating and inevitable. Tending the cabin at night was not optional. You return to the stove and check it again, even though only a few minutes have passed. The flame dances gently now, bright enough to warm the cabin without roaring. You close the vent slightly, letting the fire burn slowly, a pioneer's cautious gesture. Too much flame meant too much wood burned too quickly. Too little flame meant the cabin chilled dangerously before dawn. Balancing the stove became an art, taught through trial, error, and many cold nights. You sit again on the stool for a moment and wrap your arms around yourself. You imagine a mother quietly rising to adjust the fire while children slept in a jumble of quilts behind her. A father padding softly across the room to check the door or to listen to the wind. Elderly family members waking out of habit, sometimes unable to sleep deeply because decades of responsibility had trained their minds to stay attentive. You rise once more and glance at the bed. The quilts have settled into gentle folds. The fur glows softly in the firelight. This is the space you will eventually return to, the warmth you have built piece by piece. Every small chore tonight contributes to this comfort. Even the interruptions feel purposeful. Settlers understood that sleep came in segments, and that caring for the home formed part of that nightly journey. You ease yourself back onto the mattress again, sliding under the quilt just for a moment. The warmth greets you instantly, wrapping around your shoulders and chest. The fire continues its soothing crackle. The wind outside remains distant. For the first time since you entered this cabin, you feel the possibility of true rest gathering at the edges of your awareness. But you know that, like the pioneers, you are not quite done yet. The night has more to teach you, more rhythms to reveal, and more steps before sleep fully settles in. You breathe deeply, letting your body adjust once more, ready to continue through the long and watchful frontier night. You lie still for a few breaths, letting the warmth from the quilt settle into your skin, feeling the faint rhythm of the fire easing through the cabin. But as your body begins to relax, you sense the slow, familiar pull of morning on the frontier, the one that comes long before the sun even thinks about rising. Dawn on the frozen homestead was not gentle, and sleep rarely lasted, as long as a tired body hoped. The night might bring rest in fragments, but morning demanded movement no matter how heavy your limbs felt. You push back the quilt a little and feel a chill rush across your legs. The temperature inside the cabin has dropped again. It always does. Even with a late night tending, the fire cannot compete with the winter outside. You sit up slowly, shoulders hunched as the cold brushes along your neck. Pioneer families often woke with stiff joints and numb fingers, their breath fogging the air even indoors. One handwritten account describes waking to find a thin layer of frost coating the edge of a blanket where a sleeper's warm breath met the freezing air. You run your hand along your own quilt edge and almost imagine that delicate line of ice. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and plant your feet on the floorboards. The wood greets you with a cold so sharp it speeds your heartbeat. You curl your toes reflexively, trying to nudge warmth into them. The floor in these cabins absorbed night chill like a sponge, releasing it the moment anyone dared step down. You reach for your thick socks and tug them snug again, grateful for their scratchy embrace. Rising fully, you feel the pull of morning in your muscles. Sleep on a straw tick leaves its impressions on the body, little aches and sore spots that remind you of every uneven patch. Frontier settlers felt the same. Many noted waking with their backs tight or their legs sore, not just from work but from the hard beds. You stretch your arms upward and feel the stiffness melt slowly, like frost softening under the first touch of light. You walk toward the stove, your movement deliberate, each step an effort against the lingering cold. The fire has faded into a bed of quiet embers, glowing softly but offering little heat. Without hesitation, you open the lid and add one small log, then another. The embers respond in a muted flare, tiny sparks rising like sleepy fireflies. You blow gently to encourage them, and the flame awakens in a warm ripple. A few more seconds, and the cabin feels slightly less piercing. You stand there for a moment, letting your hands hover near the warmth. It spreads slowly across your palms, loosening the overnight chill. You think of the settlers who stood in this same posture thousands of times. Some letters describe the first minutes of the morning as a blur of shivers and quick movements, a determined attempt to get the fire roaring before anyone froze inside the house. Parents took pride in getting the warmth back before waking the rest of the family. You wander to the window next, still rubbing your hands together. The frost on the glass has thickened overnight. The patterns look like feathers, spiraling outward in delicate branching shapes. You draw a small line through the frost with your fingertip and feel the sting of cold instantly. Outside, the world rests in a muted grey, the sky not yet ready to brighten. Winter mornings took their time arriving, especially in the deep frontier woods. You inhale lightly, noticing how cold the air still feels in your lungs. Turning away from the window, you move toward the corner of the cabin where your coat now hangs. The fabric is dry, though the edges feel cool and slightly stiff. You touch it and imagine a pioneer pulling on clothes that never felt fully warm until the day wore on. The cold seeped into everything: blankets, garments, shoes, even food. The first tasks of the morning often involved thawing what needed thawing and warming what needed warming. You sit briefly on the stool again, running your hands over your arms to coax more heat into them. A quiet observation from a frontier mother describes how her children often were groggy and reluctant during winter, burying their faces in quilts to avoid the shock of the cold air. She would gently urge them out of bed with promises of warm porridge or a place by the stove. Those small comforts mattered greatly in a world where mornings felt more like challenges than gentle beginnings. You stand again and stretch your arms once more, then roll your shoulders. Your breath curls visibly in front of you. Even with the fire regaining strength, the cabin remains chilled in the deeper corners. You walk around the room in slow steps, brushing your fingers along the walls. The logs feel cold to the touch, but the drafts are softer now thanks to your earlier work. You sense the cabin waking with you, adjusting as the fire breathes back to life. You return to the bed and smooth the quilt with your palm. You imagine a pioneer family beginning their morning tasks. Some would rise immediately to start chores outside, facing the harsh cold with little hesitation. Others might tend indoor tasks first: heating water, preparing breakfast, mending clothing, checking supplies. Even children were expected to contribute. Feeding animals, fetching small logs, or filling water buckets were daily responsibilities, no matter how deep the frost lay outside. You sit again on the mattress briefly, reflecting on how different mornings were here. No alarm clocks, no buzzing devices, no lights flicking on with a switch. Waking came through cold air touching your skin, the faint hum of wind outside, or the soft urging of a family member. You lift the quilt one more time, feeling the warmth trapped beneath it, reluctant to fully surrender it. The pioneers understood that feeling. Leaving the bed meant returning to a world of labor and cold, so people often lingered for just a few minutes, stretching their limbs, murmuring quietly, bracing themselves for the day. You rise for the last time and walk back toward the stove. The fire has strengthened now, offering a steadier warmth. You crouch and open the vent slightly, listening to the flame brighten with a crisp whisper. That small sound feels like a promise. The cabin is ready to face the morning, and so are you. You take another slow breath, letting the warmth reach your cheeks and the cold retreat just a little farther. Morning has arrived in its frontier way, not with sunshine, but with quiet determination, much like the pioneers themselves. And as you stand in the gentle glow of the fire, you step more fully into the rhythm of their day, ready to face whatever the frozen frontier offers next. You step away from the stove, now warmed enough to loosen the morning stiffness, and begin a slow walk around the cabin. The fire hums quietly behind you. Your eyes adjust to the dim light, and the small details of the room come into sharper focus. The corners, especially the lower ones near the floor, feel darker and cooler than the rest of the cabin. These were the places frontier families watched carefully, because this was where tiny intruders liked to slip inside and make themselves comfortable. You crouch near the wall and feel a faint tickle of cold on your fingertips. The space between two logs looks harmless, yet thin gaps like these often allowed mice or insects to sneak in during the winter. Families knew this well. One description from an early homestead notes that keeping a cabin entirely free of small creatures was nearly impossible. Even the cleanest homes found themselves sharing space with tiny visitors looking for warmth. You inhale softly, imagining the settlers' resigned acceptance of these nighttime companions. You rise and walk toward the bed again. You lift the quilt edge and glance underneath. The floor below is clear, though you can easily imagine a mouse darting through the shadows, searching for stray crumbs or warmth lingering near the hides. Frontier homes often stored grains, flour, or root vegetables inside during the winter, and these scents attracted creatures from outside. People set simple traps or kept cats when they could, but the struggle was constant. You inhale softly, imagining the settlers' resigned acceptance of these nighttime companions. You crouch near the wall and feel a faint tickle of cold on your fingertips. The space between two logs looks harmless, yet thin gaps like these often allowed mice or insects to sneak in during the winter. Families knew this well. One description from an early homestead notes that keeping a cabin entirely free of small creatures was nearly impossible. Even the cleanest homes found themselves sharing space with tiny visitors looking for warmth. But in the darkness of a winter cabin, the mind liked to guess. You wait a second longer, but the sound does not return. You open the lid of the chest gently and look inside. Everything seems untouched. The folded cloths remain neatly stacked. You close the lid again and smooth your hand across its surface. The rough wood feels solid. Suddenly, a small tapping sound echoes from the far wall. You turn your head quickly. It is not sharp enough to alarm you, but it is clear enough to remind you that the cabin is a shared space. Perhaps a squirrel is moving across the outer logs, or perhaps something smaller has stirred within the walls. The pioneers heard these noises often and learned to live with them. You move closer to the sound, placing your ear gently near the wood. For a moment you hear nothing. Then another tiny brush. Mice, in particular, were relentless during the cold months. They squeezed into impossibly narrow places, eager for any scrap of warmth or food. Families sometimes stuffed mint leaves into cracks because the scent deterred small pests. You press your palm along the seam and imagine yourself tucking herbs there just as a weary settler once did after a long day of chores. You straighten and make your way to the door. The lower edge of the frame is slightly uneven, offering another easy path for small intruders. You push a scrap of cloth into the gap instinctively, sealing it more tightly. You picture a pioneer doing this at night, hoping it would keep not only the cold but the quiet, scurrying feet outside. Some households even placed heavy stones along the base of the door to keep animals from squeezing through. You walk toward the stove again and crouch beside it. The warmth here creates a small oasis in the room, and it is no wonder creatures sought it out. A detail mentioned in a regional account tells of insects creeping toward the stove area for heat. Settlers sometimes found beetles or other small bugs nestled near the warm stones in the morning. You glance behind the stove now, but the shadows reveal nothing. Still, you understand how such things easily went unnoticed in the dim glow of firelight. You stand and stretch, letting your thoughts shift to larger animals. Even in a well-built cabin, the sounds of wildlife outside could feel very close. The scratching of branches might mimic the claws of a raccoon. Heavy footfalls in the snow could signal a deer or, occasionally, something more imposing. A few early writings recall nights when families heard bears rustling near storage sheds, drawn by the scent of food. No one slept easily on those nights. You cross the room again and kneel beside the bed, smoothing the quilt. Now that the cabin is warmer, you are more aware of the tiny crackles and whispers around you. Not threatening, not even particularly disruptive, just the presence of life. Frontier families did not think of pests the way we do today. They understood that living in the wilderness meant sharing space with creatures that simply wanted the same thing humans did: shelter from the cold. You lift the fur at the foot of the bed, checking beneath the folded corner. You find nothing but shadows. Still, the simple act of checking mirrors the habits of those who lived here long ago. They moved quietly around their cabins, inspecting corners, shifting blankets, listening carefully. These small routines kept the home safe, or at least made it feel safe, even on nights when something skittered across the floor or fluttered near the rafters. You rise again and wander toward the rafters. A soft chirp echoes faintly above you. You tilt your head and smile. Birds sometimes nestled in the upper beams, entering through gaps in the roofline. In the coldest months, even birds sought the warmth that bled gently from the stovepipe. One pioneer note describes waking to tiny feathers drifting down as a sparrow settled into a beam's notch. You feel the rafters with the flat of your palm, sensing nothing alive but appreciating the idea. You step back into the center of the room. Fire crackles again. The shadows sway. You feel the cabin's inhabitants, real or imagined, moving around you in gentle rhythms. These small companions shaped the nighttime tableau of frontier life. Their presence was not always welcome, yet their sounds became part of the nightly routine, accepted with tired humor and occasional annoyance. You sit on the stool near the stove once more and let the warmth settle across your knees. The cabin feels alive, not in a threatening way, but in a quiet and natural one. The people who lived here before you understood that the frontier was not meant to be controlled. It was something to coexist with. Even inside these log walls, nature found its moments to slip through. The fire glows brighter as you add another piece of wood. The warmth pushes back the shadows, creating soft pools of light where once there were dark corners. You realize that the cabin, with all its creaks and whispers, feels a little more familiar now. You settle deeper into the warmth, ready for whatever the winter night reveals next. You linger near the warmth of the stove, feeling the quiet pulse of heat seep gently into your legs. The cabin has settled again into that deep winter stillness, the kind that lies heavy in the air and makes every small sound feel amplified. You draw a slow breath and let it out softly, noticing how the glow from the fire paints the room with warm hues. Yet even this gentle comfort cannot erase one of the hardest realities faced by frontier families during winter nights: the fear of illness creeping into the home. You step toward the bed, the layers of quilt and fur swaying slightly as you touch them. Illness in a frontier cabin carried a particular weight. There were no doctors living nearby, no pharmacies, no quick remedies. A simple cold could turn dangerous, and fever in the middle of a frozen night felt like a threat looming in the dark. Personal letters from the era often mention nights spent watching over a coughing child or tending to a feverish parent, too afraid to close their eyes. You place your palm on the quilt now and imagine the heat of a sick person lying beneath it, shivering while the fire struggled to keep the cabin warm. You ease down on the edge of the bed and let your fingers rest on your knees. The cold in the room isn't harsh at this moment, but you can still feel it lingering along the walls. You think about how illness spread quickly in confined cabins where families slept close together. One sick child could soon mean several coughing through the darkness. The sound of labored breathing, the shiver of fever, the restless tossing could keep a whole family awake. You imagine that weight pressing on everyone as they listened, hoping the night would pass quietly. The night continues its slow conversation outside, blending whispers of wind with distant animal calls. And as you listen, you begin to understand how the pioneers found rest here, not by shutting out the night, but by letting its sounds guide them gently into sleep. You rise from the bed and walk slowly toward the table where a small tin cup sits. Many families kept herbal teas or infusions ready at night in case someone woke with a sore throat. Willow bark, pine needle tea, or simple warm water with honey if they were lucky enough to have it. You pick up the cup and hold it gently, imagining the weight of responsibility settlers must have felt. If a family member fell ill, tending them became an around-the-clock task. One account describes a mother sitting awake night after night beside the stove, warming cloths to lay on her child's forehead. You turn the empty cup in your hand and place it back down with care. The echo of the metal on wood sounds faint and hollow, like a memory stretching across time. Your gaze drifts toward the window. Frost coats the glass in feathery swirls, and you know how dangerous cold air could be for someone already weakened. Families often pushed sick beds closer to the stove, sometimes moving furniture in the middle of the night just to bring another few degrees of warmth. You walk back to the stove now and place your hand on the iron surface. The heat grounds you again. You picture a parent kneeling exactly where you stand, adjusting the fire with trembling hands as their child struggled to breathe behind them. You move to the far corner of the cabin, where a rough wooden stool sits near a small shelf. The shelf holds simple containers: a jar of dried herbs, a folded cloth, a small pouch tied with twine. These items represent hope more than medicine. Settlers used what they had, sometimes guided by folk wisdom passed down from family lines. Some remedies soothed symptoms. Others were little more than rituals offering comfort when no real cure existed. You brush your fingers along the jars, imagining the anxiety of a parent desperately choosing which remedy to try in the dark while a fever burned hotter in the bed. You pause and take a slow breath. A gentle shift in the wind outside sends a faint chill through the chinking. You notice it instantly, imagining how dangerous even a short draft could be for someone shivering under quilts. This awareness shaped how families moved during the night. They checked cracks repeatedly, tucked quilts tightly, placed warmed stones by feet, and ensured the fire burned steadily. A household tended to an illness with the same vigilance they gave to the stove. You feel a heaviness in the room as you walk back toward the bed, but not an unpleasant one. It is the weight of understanding what nights like these meant for frontier families. You sit gently on the straw tick and smooth the quilt with your hand. A quiet rustle echoes through the cabin, and for a moment you imagine the sound of a child shifting in sleep, a faint cough breaking the silence. The sound would have pulled a parent instantly upright, heart pounding, ready to tend again. You lie back for a moment, resting your head on the pillow. The low light from the stove flickers across the rafters. Illness in a place like this blurred the boundary between waking and sleeping. Settlers drifted in and out of shallow rest, always listening, always prepared to rise. Some nights they hardly slept at all. A study of frontier correspondence suggests that families often kept a kind of quiet watch rotation, not formalized but born of necessity. Whoever was lightest of sleep took the role of guardian for a few hours. You roll onto your side and pull the quilt closer around your shoulders. The warmth helps you imagine the small relief settlers felt when fevers finally broke or coughs softened with dawn. The morning light brought hope, and with it, a renewed sense of strength. Yet even on those difficult nights, the frontier people rarely succumbed to despair. Their resilience formed the backbone of their survival. You sit up slowly, letting the quilt fall into place. The fire crackles behind you, offering a soft reassurance. You take a step toward the stove, placing one more piece of wood inside. The flame welcomes it with a gentle flare. You rest your palms near the warmth and close your eyes for a moment, grateful for its steady presence. Illness was an unwelcome visitor in these frozen cabins, unpredictable and frightening. Yet families faced it with quiet determination. They did what they could with what they had, and through long nights of tending, listening, and hoping, they forged a strength that carried them through the harshest winters. You open your eyes again, feeling grounded and calm. The cabin breathes softly around you, and you know the night has more to reveal. You turn back toward the bed, ready for the story to guide you deeper into the cold frontier night. You stand in the center of the cabin, feeling the fire's gentle warmth trace the air, while the winter cold presses quietly at the walls. After thinking of illness and nighttime worries, your attention shifts toward the practical intelligence that frontier families used to soften the brutal cold. They did not simply endure the winter nights. They adapted, experimented, and traded small tricks among neighbors to make sleep bearable. The room around you holds echoes of their ingenuity, and as you walk slowly toward the bed again, you begin to recognize the simple but clever strategies they used when the temperature dropped to its harshest lows. You kneel beside the bed and slide your hand beneath the quilt, imagining how the pioneers arranged things before lying down. One well-documented practice involved heating stones near the fire and wrapping them in cloth to place at the foot of the bed. You move toward the stove now and lift one of the smooth river stones that had been resting nearby. It is warm against your fingertips, radiating steady heat. Families often prepared several of these during winter nights, placing them along the length of the straw tick or tucking them near a child's feet. The warmth did not last long, but it offered precious comfort during the coldest first hours of sleep. You carry the stone to the bed and nestle it beneath the furs. As you slide it into place, you feel the heat pulse through the layers, subtle but reassuring. You smooth the quilt over it and imagine how a child's relieved sigh might have sounded when their tiny toes found that pocket of warmth. These heated stones did not solve the problem of freezing nights, but they softened the first sting of cold that seeped into the bones. You rise again and walk toward the far corner of the cabin, where a thick wool blanket hangs from a peg. Frontier families often hung blankets or animal skins on the walls to trap warmth and reduce drafts. You take the blanket down and unfold it, feeling its dense weight. You drape it across the wall behind the bed, securing the corners with wooden pegs. Immediately the space feels more insulated, the cold from the logs muted by the fabric's heavy embrace. Many settlers used this trick, especially in older cabins where the wood had begun to shrink with age. Hanging fabric helped create a small pocket of warmth that held through the night. You return to the bed and sit on the edge again, letting your hands rest on the quilt. You picture entire families arranging blankets over doorways or stretching hides along the rafters to trap rising heat. A journal from a frontier mother mentions draping quilts over the windows every night, because even the faintest breeze from poor chinking felt unbearable when temperatures plummeted. As you sit here, you feel that logic deeply. The crackling frost outside, the thin wooden walls, the constant battle to keep warmth inside. Every layer mattered. You stand again and walk toward the window, brushing your hand across the frost-covered frame. Outside, the night feels vast. The moonlight glints faintly on the snow. You picture another cabin glowing faintly somewhere in the distance, a pinprick of warmth in a sea of white. Those faint lights guided travelers across dark fields or forest trails. One family might leave a lantern burning longer if they expected a neighbor returning late from tending their animals. You step back and let your gaze travel around the cabin. The settlers relied not only on materials but also on placement. The bed was almost always placed near the stove or hearth, but not so close that the quilts risked catching sparks. Too far away, and the bed remained icy. You rest your hands on the bed frame and understand how carefully families balanced their sleeping arrangements. Children were often put closest to the stove, elders nearby, and those who could tolerate cold slept farthest away. You cross the cabin to the table and notice a small cloth pouch sitting near the corner. Settlers sometimes filled such pouches with heated grain or dried beans to create makeshift warmers. You lift the pouch and feel its soft weight. Though cool now, you imagine heating it on the stove and tucking it beneath the quilts. A small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. You set it back down and smile softly at the thought of such creative resourcefulness. A quiet shift of the wind outside presses gently against the cabin wall. You pause and listen, then you move toward the window. Frost glitters along the edges, forming delicate patterns that glow faintly in the firelight. You reach for a spare blanket and hang it across the window frame, letting the fabric fall in thick folds. The cabin dims slightly, but the air grows steadier, the warmth less threatened by stray drafts. Some families even covered their windows daily during winter, lifting the cloth only when daylight was needed. You step away from the window and take a long breath. The room feels cozier now, softer, more insulated. You feel as though you've helped the cabin prepare for the long night ahead. The pioneers believed in working with the materials they had, shaping their environment with small acts of practical intelligence. They did not expect perfect warmth, only enough comfort to keep frost at bay. You wander back toward the fire and crouch beside it. The glow bathes your face in a soft orange light. You stir the embers gently, letting the flames breathe. As the fire brightens, the warmth spreads. You hold your hands close to the iron door and savor the growing heat. You imagine a young woman in a frontier cabin adjusting the fire in the same way, perhaps humming to herself while her family waited under the quilts. You rise slowly and return to the bed. You sit for a moment, letting the warmth from the heated stone begin to seep upward through the blankets. You lay your palm upon the hide at the foot of the bed and feel the heavy softness of it. You touch the quilt you hung on the wall and feel how the fabric steadies the air. All these small changes create a nest-like space tucked away from the frozen wilderness beyond the walls. As you sit there, you remember something noted in a set of interviews collected from descendants of frontier families. They spoke of winter as a teacher. It forced people to learn patience, cleverness, and appreciation for small comforts. Warmth became a prize earned through tiny acts: drying clothes, patching drafts, layering bedding, heating stones, and tending fires. Every habit, no matter how simple, played a role in easing the cold. You lie back again, letting your head rest on the pillow. The warmth beneath the quilts feels soothing now, calm yet fragile. You close your eyes briefly. The cabin's dim glow seeps behind your eyelids. You imagine the pioneers drifting into sleep with the knowledge that they had done everything possible to make their night bearable. The rest was left to the fire, the quilts, the stones, and the quiet strength of their own bodies. You open your eyes once more and sit up slowly, feeling the lingering warmth around you. Each small improvement in the cabin reflects the settlers' resilience and creativity. You stand, letting the quilts fall naturally back into place, and face the center of the room. The fire glows steadily. The blankets hold tight along the walls. The bed feels ready to embrace the night. You rise slowly and return to the bed. You sit for a moment, letting the warmth from the heated stone begin to seep upward through the blankets. You lay your palm upon the hide at the foot of the bed and feel the heavy softness of it. You touch the quilt you hung on the wall and feel how the fabric steadies the air. All these small changes create a nest-like space tucked away from the frozen wilderness beyond the walls. You reach out and run your hand along the quilt once more, then slowly lie back, letting your mind roam further. Some researchers who study sleep patterns in historical environments suggest that the pioneers may have experienced segmented sleep. They might drift into an early period of slumber, wake naturally for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then return to bed for a second round of rest. In that quiet middle period, people often turn to prayer, reflection, or conversation. You take a deep breath and let it out softly, sensing the deepening quiet within the cabin. These simple winter tricks were more than survival methods. They were ways of making life bearable, of turning a frozen frontier into a place where sleep could gently take hold. You press your ear gently near the doorframe, listening. The wind outside has softened, turning into long, quiet sighs that drift across the frozen ground. Nights like this often brought unexpected visits. Perhaps a neighbor checking on a family during a storm. Perhaps a messenger arriving with news. Frontier communities depended on such visits for safety and survival. You imagine reaching for the latch, opening the door to a figure wrapped in wool and frost, breath rising in pale bursts. You can almost hear the murmured greeting. The pioneers treated such nighttime interactions with quiet seriousness. They welcomed visitors because they understood that the cold punished solitude. A warm fire shared by two families could mean the difference between comfort and hardship. You stand in the center of the cabin, feeling the fire's gentle warmth trace the air, while the winter cold presses quietly at the walls. After thinking of illness and nighttime worries, your attention shifts toward the practical intelligence that frontier families used to soften the brutal cold. They did not simply endure the winter nights. They adapted, experimented, and traded small tricks among neighbors to make sleep bearable. But more often, it meant a neighbor braving the cold to check on livestock, share food, or warn of a storm moving across the valley. You wander back toward the fire and crouch beside it. The glow bathes your face in a soft orange light. You stir the embers gently, letting the flames breathe. As the fire brightens, the warmth spreads. You hold your hands close to the iron door and savor the growing heat. You imagine a young woman in a frontier cabin adjusting the fire in the same way, perhaps humming to herself while her family waited under the quilts. You press your ear gently near the doorframe, listening. The wind outside has softened, turning into long, quiet sighs that drift across the frozen ground. Nights like this often brought unexpected visits. Perhaps a neighbor checking on a family during a storm. Perhaps a messenger arriving with news. Frontier communities depended on such visits for safety and survival. You wander back toward the fire and crouch beside it. The glow bathes your face in a soft orange light. You stir the embers gently, letting the flames breathe. As the fire brightens, the warmth spreads. You hold your hands close to the iron door and savor the growing heat. You imagine a young woman in a frontier cabin adjusting the fire in the same way, perhaps humming to herself while her family waited under the quilts. These small acts of watchfulness created a network of quiet protection stretching across the frozen land. You carry the stone to the bed and nestle it beneath the furs. As you slide it into place, you feel the heat pulse through the layers. Subtle but reassuring. You smooth the quilt over it and imagine how a child's relieved sigh might have sounded when their tiny toes found that pocket of warmth. These heated stones did not solve the problem of freezing nights, but they softened the first sting of cold that seeped into the bones. You lean forward, resting your elbows on your knees, and imagine the silhouettes of neighbors moving through the snow to offer help before dawn. You carry the stone to the bed and nestle it beneath the furs. As you slide it into place, you feel the heat pulse through the layers, subtle but reassuring. You smooth the quilt over it and imagine how a child's relieved sigh might have sounded when their tiny toes found that pocket of warmth. These heated stones did not solve the problem of freezing nights, but they softened the first sting of cold that seeped into the bones. You stand quietly in the softened warmth you have created, the quilts hanging on the wall muffling the drafts, the fire glowing with a steady breath. The cabin feels protected, almost snug, yet the wilderness just beyond the door never truly disappears. Out on the frontier, isolation was a constant companion, and with it came a powerful reliance on neighbors. Even in the frozen months when travel was difficult, families watched over one another. You pause near the stove and place your palm on the edge of the iron, feeling its solid heat. You imagine offering a cup of warm broth to a neighbor who has walked through bitter wind just to share news of a broken fence or a wandering cow. These were small human moments in a harsh world. Even the act of sitting quietly together beside the fire became a gesture of solidarity that helped families endure the winter's long nights. You turn toward the door again. It stands still and closed, but its presence feels heavier now. Out on the frontier, the door was not merely an entrance. It was a threshold between vulnerability and community, between solitude and connection. When someone knocked in the night, the entire household became alert. The fire brightened as if welcoming the encounter. Children sat up and listened. Parents exchanged glances. The rhythm of the night shifted. You stand in the center of the cabin, feeling the fire's gentle warmth trace the air, while the winter cold presses quietly at the walls. After thinking of illness and nighttime worries, your attention shifts toward the practical intelligence that frontier families used to soften the brutal cold. They did not simply endure the winter nights. They adapted, experimented, and traded small tricks among neighbors to make sleep bearable. You ease down onto the pillow and look at the rafters above you. Even when the cabin felt silent, the awareness of neighbors shaped how people slept. They trusted that if trouble came, someone nearby might notice a strange noise or a missing lantern. They relied on each other's attunement to the land. This communal sense of security made sleep possible even on the coldest nights. You stand quietly in the softened warmth you have created, the quilts hanging on the wall muffling the drafts, the fire glowing with a steady breath. The cabin feels protected, almost snug, yet the wilderness just beyond the door never truly disappears. Out on the frontier, isolation was a constant companion, and with it came a powerful reliance on neighbors. Even in the frozen months when travel was difficult, families watched over one another. You rise and place your hand on the doorframe once more, feeling the cool grain beneath your palm. Out there, Neighbors watched over one another, their vigilance stretching across snowfields and through forests. In here, the warmth you have built carries that same spirit of care. You step back toward the center of the room, breathing calmly, ready to follow the story deeper into the winter night. You stand in the dim glow of the fire, feeling its warmth settle gently against your skin. The cabin is quiet again, wrapped in the soft hush that arrives once the wind outside settles into a patient rhythm. As you move toward the center of the room, your thoughts drift toward the spiritual and emotional rituals that shaped the frontier night. Sleep did not simply happen in these frozen cabins. Many families eased into it with quiet practices that blended practicality, belief, and a deep need for comfort in a world that felt far larger than themselves. You take a slow step toward the table and place your hand lightly on its surface. The worn wood is cool beneath your fingertips, but it carries an energy that seems reflective, almost reverent. This was where families gathered not just for eating or mending, but for moments of quiet preparation before sleep. Diaries from the frontier often mention short prayers whispered at night. Not elaborate or formal, just a few soft words, hoping for safety through the dark and strength for the next day. You straighten your posture slightly, imagining yourself whispering the same gentle hopes into the shadowed room. You lift your gaze to the shelf above the table. There sits a small folded paper booklet, its edges slightly curled. Families often kept a worn Bible or a small book of verses nearby. Many settlers read by firelight before bed, letting the rhythmic cadence of familiar words calm their weary minds. You reach out and trace the spine of the little booklet with one finger. Though the text inside is not visible, you can almost hear the soothing murmur of someone reading aloud while children nestle beneath their blankets. You move slowly toward the bed, running your fingers along the quilt as you pass. The softness invites contemplation. Frontier life was full of hardship, but the quiet moments before sleep offered space for reflection. One family journal describes a father sitting on the edge of the bed each night, sharing a brief story from his childhood to comfort his children before they drifted off. These stories connected generations, reminding families that endurance ran in their blood. You sink gently onto the mattress and sit still, letting the quiet expand around you. The fire crackles softly behind you, its rhythm steady and reassuring. You close your eyes for a moment and listen. In this silence, it becomes easy to understand why settlers attached meaning to the night. The darkness was immense, filled with unknowns, and yet they faced it with a serene acceptance. Many believed that the quiet helped the mind settle, offering a chance to release the day's worries. You take a slow breath and imagine letting your own thoughts sink gently into the warmth beneath you. You open your eyes and lift the corner of the quilt. The dim light brushes the fabric in soft ripples. Some families used simple rituals to mark the transition from evening work to nighttime rest. A mother might brush crumbs from the mattress. A father might adjust the quilt edges with slow, deliberate motions. Children might share a final whisper or a soft giggle before lying still. You lift the quilt higher now, letting the gesture feel purposeful, like closing a chapter before turning the page. You stand and walk back toward the stove. The glow washes over your face, comforting and alive. You place one hand on the iron door, feeling its warmth seep into your palm. Many settlers believed in the symbolic presence of the hearth as a guardian through the night. Some wrote that they felt safer when the fire glowed steadily, as though its light pushed back the uncertainty lurking in the dark. You feel that truth now as you let the fire's glow hold your attention. You lower yourself onto the stool near the stove and rest your elbows on your knees. A gentle memory from a frontier letter describes how, on especially cold nights, families sat in a small circle before bed, sharing silence instead of words. They watched the flames dance, each person lost in their own thoughts, yet united by the warmth and the rhythm of the fire. You sit the same way now, letting that quiet unity settle in your chest like a slow, steady heartbeat. You rise and walk toward the corner where a set of small items sits neatly arranged. A folded cloth, a tin cup, a tiny wooden token carved with simple shapes. These objects could easily have been charms or keepsakes. Some frontier families carried tokens representing loved ones far away or small items believed to bring comfort. Whether these objects held spiritual meaning or simply sentimental value varied greatly, but their purpose remained the same: easing the mind as the night closed in. You pick up the wooden token and feel its smooth surface warm slowly in your palm before setting it gently back. You return toward the bed, the firelight stretching your shadow across the floorboards. The room feels deeper now, filled with the layered emotions of countless nights lived here. You sit once more on the quilt's edge, resting one hand on the fur. Frontier families often ended their night routines with gratitude, not spoken dramatically, just a quiet acknowledgement of shelter, warmth, or safety. Even on hard days, a moment of gratitude softened the weight of life at the edge of the wilderness. You reach for the corner of the quilt again and lay it over your legs as if preparing for sleep. The softness settles around you, blending warmth and memory. You gaze toward the darkened window, frost glimmering faintly along the edges. The wilderness beyond those patterns feels vast, and yet the cabin around you feels peaceful. You imagine yourself settling into this moment just as a pioneer would, strengthened by the rituals that turned cold nights into opportunities for rest and reflection. You rise once more, letting the quilt fall gently back into place. The cabin seems to exhale with you as you take a slow breath. The rituals you've followed tonight echo the quiet habits of those who came before you. These practices, simple and small, prepared the mind for rest, even when the world outside remained uncertain. You walk back toward the center of the room and stand still. The fire glows gently. The blankets on the wall soften the drafts. The warm stone under the quilt waits for you, and somewhere in the quiet, you sense the steady, grounding presence of the frontier spirit that carried families through their coldest nights. You take one more breath and let it settle. The night welcomes you deeper, ready to show the next layer of its winter story. You return toward the bed, the firelight stretching your shadow across the floorboards. The room feels deeper now, filled with the layered emotions of countless nights lived here. You sit once more on the quilt's edge, resting one hand on the fur. Frontier families often ended their night routines with gratitude, not spoken dramatically, just a quiet acknowledgement of shelter, warmth, or safety. Even on hard days, a moment of gratitude softened the weight of life at the edge of the wilderness. You return toward the bed, the firelight stretching your shadow across the floorboards. The room feels deeper now, filled with the layered emotions of countless nights lived here. You sit once more on the quilt's edge, resting one hand on the fur. Frontier families often ended their night routines with gratitude, not spoken dramatically, just a quiet acknowledgement of shelter, warmth, or safety. Even on hard days, a moment of gratitude softened the weight of life at the edge of the wilderness. You pause in the center of the room, taking in the softened glow of the stove and the stillness that wraps itself around the cabin like a thick wool blanket. The night feels deeper now, settled and steady, but you know the pioneers still had one more challenge to face before true rest could begin. Not every winter night passed quietly. It stirred a quiet urgency in them, prompting last-minute checks of the fire, the door, the livestock, anything that might need reinforcement before the tempest arrived. You rest your fingertips lightly on the frosted glass. It trembles almost imperceptibly. Outside, a low murmur begins, the sound of distant wind gathering strength. You draw your hand back and inhale, feeling the air inside the cabin tighten slightly, as though the walls themselves brace for what approaches. Frontier families recognized this sensation well. Many wrote that the air changed before a storm, becoming sharper, almost metallic. When this happened at night, families had no choice but to hunker down and trust in their preparation. You lift your hand from the door and tighten the hide pressed along the bottom, making sure it seals the frame more securely. You step away from the window and walk toward the door. The grain of the wood feels colder than before, as if absorbing the tension in the wind. You press your palm flat against it and close your eyes. In the distance, the wind grows louder, pushing softly against the cabin. Winter storms could erupt with frightening speed on the frontier, turning familiar landscapes into blinding mazes of white. You lift a fold of the quilt and run your hand beneath it, imagining a child's fingers clinging to the fabric during a long winter storm. You walk toward the bed and sit on the edge, listening. The wind slides along the outside logs in slow, rising waves. It is still gentle, but there is strength building beneath it. Settlers lying under their quilts felt that same rising hum. Many accounts describe families pulling their sleeping children closer, smoothing blankets down with a bit more care, whispering reassurances even as their own nerves twitched with anticipation. The roar of the storm paired with the fading warmth inside created a dread that lingered long after the tempest passed. You rise again and cross to the stove. The fire glows softly, but you know a storm demands a stronger flame. You lift the lid, add a sturdy log, and stir the embers until the flames flare brighter. The warmth pushes outward, filling the room with confidence. Frontier families often fed the fire generously during storms, knowing that if the flames died while the wind howled outside, the cold would invade quickly. Families listened carefully for signs of trouble: a sudden crack in a roof beam, a loose shingle lifted by the wind, or drifting snow accumulating too heavily in one spot. You watch the flames dance higher, reflecting in the metal of the stove door. You feel the comfort of the fire spreading along your arms, pushing back the first signs of the storm. Then you turn and move toward the rafters. A faint thump echoes above you as the wind shifts direction, nudging snow along the roof. You follow the sound with your eyes, tracing the shadows above. In a frontier cabin, every noise during a storm mattered. You walk toward the far corner where a small stack of spare cloths rests. Settlers kept rags and old clothing ready to plug any gaps that might appear during the storm. You pick up one of the folded cloths and carry it with you as you walk the perimeter of the room, checking each seam where log meets log. You feel no drafts yet, but the act itself feels grounding. It mirrors the careful gestures families use to protect their fragile warmth. Some journals mention how even the smallest hole could become a freezing tunnel when wind drove snow through it. You pause near the window again. The frost lifts slightly as the wind pushes against the glass. The outside world has become little more than a blur, shadows moving behind white. You imagine waking during a storm to find snow piling up against the pane, slowly sealing the window shut. This could be protective or dangerous, depending on how much air the family needed inside. The pioneers understood that storms were both threat and insulation. They blocked visibility, but they could also muffle the wind and trap pockets of warmth against the cabin walls. You step back from the window and wrap your arms around yourself for a moment. The storm has not reached full force, but its presence changes the cabin's atmosphere. The quiet you felt earlier now feels different, tighter, more alert. You sit once more on the stool near the stove, feeling the fire's warmth steady your breath. A thoughtful detail recorded in a settler's letter notes that during storms, families often stayed awake longer than usual, listening for changes in the wind. Sleep came only in brief stretches. Parents took turns rising to check the fire or listen at the door. Some even tied ropes from the cabin to the barn before the storm hit, so they could reach their animals safely if needed in the night. You picture yourself stepping outside in winds that could steal all visibility in seconds, holding a rope for guidance, snow lashing against your face. The thought alone makes you grateful for the safety of the cabin's glow. You rise from the stool and walk slowly toward the bed. The quilts seem heavier now, as if absorbing the tension in the wind. You slide your hand beneath the layers and feel the faint residual heat from the warmed stone you tucked there earlier. Even this small pocket of warmth feels more essential now. You lower yourself onto the mattress and lie back for a moment, listening to the storm's early voice build outside. The wind swells, then dips, then rises again, its patterns unpredictable. You imagine a frontier family lying here, eyes half closed, bodies exhausted, but minds alert. They listen to the storm as though it were a living thing, gauging its strength, hoping it would fade before morning. Some nights, the wind screamed so loudly that sleep became impossible. Other nights, it lulled families into a strange, restless half-sleep, the storm's voice threading through their dreams. You sit up slowly, feeling the weight of this imagined vigilance. Then you stand and return to the fire one last time, adjusting the vent to keep the flames steady. The cabin glows warmly, fighting back the storm's deepening presence. You breathe deeply, letting the warmth fill your chest. The frontier storm has begun its slow climb into the night, and the cabin braces itself in quiet resilience. You place your hand on the top quilt, grateful for its warmth, then lift your gaze toward the darkened rafters as you prepare to follow the pioneers deeper into their long, restless winter night. You stand by the stove for a long moment, letting the warmth soak through your hands while the wind outside grows more restless. The cabin doesn't shake, not yet, but the murmurs of the storm have deepened into something fuller. You turn your head slightly, listening as the gusts thread themselves around the logs like a warning whispered through the dark. Now your thoughts drift toward another long, cold frontier reality, guarding the night. Sleep came in shifts, in fragments, sometimes in uneasy slices of rest taken between small responsibilities. You step slowly toward the center of the room, sensing the rhythm of these old night watches settle around you. You walk to the door and place your palm against it once more. The wood trembles faintly under the growing pressure of the wind. You imagine a pioneer rising from bed, moving quietly through the cabin, so as not to disturb the others. A soft step here, a pause there, listening, feeling, watching. Frontier nights demanded attention, not because danger was constant, but because anything from a dying fire to a wandering animal could spell trouble if ignored for too long. You turn away from the door and head toward the stove again. The flames ripple inside, bright but not loud. You open the lid slightly and tap the embers with the poker. Sparks drift upward like tiny orange fireflies before fading into the darkness. Then you add a small log, watching the flames accept it slowly. Frontier families often rotated fire duty during the night, with one person rising every few hours to check the stove. It wasn't a formal schedule, but an instinctive pattern shaped by countless cold nights. Even children learned to stir the embers gently, to place the next piece of wood with care. You close the lid and let the fire settle again. The glow fills the cabin in warm waves, keeping the storm at a respectful distance for now. You step away from the stove and walk slowly toward the small window. Frost covers most of the glass, but the little that remains clear shows only swirling white. The storm has deepened. You imagine a pioneer standing where you now stand, checking to see whether the family's barn lantern flickered in the distance. Sometimes they looked for it as confirmation that their animals were safe. Sometimes they looked for it just to reassure themselves that the world beyond the window still existed. You turn toward the rafters, hearing the faint pop of wood expanding and contracting under the shifting temperature. You tilt your head slightly, listening more closely. The storm brushes the roof with thin, icy fingers. The logs creak in response. You walk across the room to the opposite wall and press your hand to the chinking. It feels solid. No wind slips through here yet. Frontier sentinels, often fathers or older siblings, made these rounds several times each night, checking for any new draft that needed blocking. You take a slow step back and glance toward the bed. The quilts rest peacefully for now. You sit on the mattress briefly, feeling its familiar unevenness. If you are part of a frontier household, this might be the moment when you wake a sleepy partner gently, telling them it's their turn to watch the fire or listen for the wind. Sleep continued in fragments, shared between people who depended on one another. One tired pair of eyes replaced another. Frontier sentinels, often fathers or older siblings, made these rounds several times each night, checking for any new draft that needed blocking. One tired body slipped under the quilt while another rose to face the cold. You open your eyes again as another gust pushes against the cabin. The wind's voice deepens into a long howl. You sit up and swing your legs over the side of the bed, breathing deeply. You walk toward the door in quiet, deliberate steps. The frontier night watch required calm nerves. Not every sound meant danger. Not every gust required a response. The key was awareness. Settlers learned to differentiate between ordinary noises and the ones that whispered of real risk. You lie back for a moment, resting your head against the pillow. The faint glow from the stove reaches your face in soft pulses. You close your eyes briefly and imagine the feeling of drifting into shallow sleep while knowing your turn to rise might arrive in minutes. Frontier families didn't seek the uninterrupted sleep that modern life promises. They accepted their circumstances. Their sleep had texture, layers, interruptions, and watchful pauses. You place your hand lightly on the latch and listen again. The storm's howl shifts, carrying a distant echo. Perhaps just wind curling through the trees. Perhaps a heavy branch falling. Perhaps nothing at all. You step back, satisfied for the moment, and head toward the small shelf where a lantern rests, its glass slightly fogged with age. You touch it gently. In a real frontier cabin, this lantern might be lit only if absolutely necessary, because oil was precious. You walk toward the stove again and crouch beside it. The flames move softly in their iron chamber. You keep your hand near the heat, absorbing what you can. This warmth was essential for sentinels who rose in the cold hours of night. Some frontier families described rotating nights based on age or strength. Younger children slept more deeply while older siblings shared the burden of watching and tending. Others relied solely on parents, who attended the night vigil with weary determination. You turn toward the rafters, hearing the faint pop of wood expanding and contracting under the shifting temperature. You tilt your head slightly, listening more closely. The storm brushes the roof with thin, icy fingers. The logs creak in response. You walk across the room to the opposite wall and press your hand to the chinking. It feels solid. No wind slips through here yet. You rise and stretch your arms slightly, feeling the stiffness ease. You walk toward the back wall and check the seams once more. All is still. Then you turn to the window again, listening for the storm's rhythm. It grows, then fades, then grows again. You imagine how those variations once guided a sentinel's choices. If the wind surged suddenly, they might rise to push a heavy pot against a draft. You step toward the bed and sit gently on its edge. The firelight dances across the quilts, making them appear softer, warmer. You smooth the fabric with your palm. This is where the sentinel eventually returned, climbing quietly back under the covers, careful not to wake the others. That half-asleep moment between duty and rest must have carried both relief and heavy exhaustion. You imagine pulling the quilts back over your shoulders, listening to the fire crackle softly, and letting yourself drift for a short while before rising again. If the storm lulled, they might take the moment to peek outside, making sure snow had not drifted dangerously against the door. You rise once more, standing tall in the gentle glow of the fire. You scan the room, feeling the space breathe with you. The storm continues outside, insistent but not overwhelming. Inside, the balance holds. This is what a frontier night watch looked like: steady, calm, attentive, and woven into the hours between dusk and dawn. You stand for a final moment by the stove and let the warmth soak into you. Another layer of frontier life has revealed itself, and the night invites you to follow its story even deeper. If the storm lulled, they might take the moment to peek outside, making sure snow had not drifted dangerously against the door. Now your thoughts drift toward the final and most personal part of the frontier night, the slow surrender of the body, the mind, and the spirit into sleep itself. If the storm lulled, they might take the moment to peek outside, making sure snow had not drifted dangerously against the door. Frontier families treasured such warmth. understanding that once they settled into bed, they needed every pocket of heat to coax their bodies into deeper rest. You walk toward the stove again and crouch beside it. The flames move softly in their iron chamber. You keep your hand near the heat, absorbing what you can. This warmth was essential for sentinels who rose in the cold hours of night. Some frontier families described rotating nights based on age or strength. Younger children slept more deeply while older siblings shared the burden of watching and tending. Others relied solely on parents, who attended the night vigil with weary determination. You stand in the warm halo cast by the stove, listening as the storm's voice settles into a steadier rhythm outside. The wind has become a low, rumbling force, no longer shrieking but humming as it moves across the frozen land. You breathe slowly and feel the cabin respond, its walls gently shifting, its seams holding firm, its warmth deepening. You lift your legs carefully and slide beneath the quilt. The fabric folds around you with an immediate, reassuring heaviness. Your wool nightshirt brushes softly against your skin. The warmth gathers slowly around your chest and shoulders. You inch deeper into the bedding, letting your toes find the last traces of heat near the stone. The fur draped across the top settles like a quiet guardian. For the first time tonight, the bed feels truly ready to hold you. You walk toward the stove again and crouch beside it. The flames move softly in their iron chamber. You keep your hand near the heat, absorbing what you can. This warmth was essential for sentinels who rose in the cold hours of night. Some frontier families described rotating nights based on age or strength. Younger children slept more deeply while older siblings shared the burden of watching and tending. Others relied solely on parents, who attended the night vigil with weary determination. It was their lullaby, delivered by nature and hearth together. You close your eyes and let your breathing slow. The darkness behind your eyelids feels warm, not cold. You imagine the settlers lying like this, the day's labor fading from their bodies as they drifted into that soft space between waking and sleep. Some accounts describe drifting off to the gentle tapping of snow against the window, or to the faint sound of ashes settling in the stove. These sounds brought reassurance, signs that the cabin held strong against the winter night. You lift your legs carefully and slide beneath the quilt. The fabric folds around you with an immediate, reassuring heaviness. Your wool nightshirt brushes softly against your skin. The warmth gathers slowly around your chest and shoulders. You inch deeper into the bedding, letting your toes find the last traces of heat near the stone. The fur draped across the top settles like a quiet guardian. For the first time tonight, the bed feels truly ready to hold you. You open your eyes briefly and gaze toward the rafters. The shadows sway gently there, painted by the fire's glow. They move like soft waves in the dark. You understand why frontier sleepers often spoke of drifting into dreams as though drifting into another room of the cabin. The boundaries between the physical space and the dream space felt thin in a place where sound, cold, and fire created such an intimate environment. You shift again, rolling onto your back, and let the weight of the quilt settle fully onto you. Your breathing deepens. The wind quiets for a moment, pausing as though gathering strength for another gust. You feel the cabin pulse gently around you. It is not silent, but it is peaceful. This was how the pioneers entered sleep, surrounded by sounds that reminded them of the world's vastness and their cabin's small sanctuary within it. A soft thought crosses your mind. Frontier families often felt a subtle gratitude at this stage of the night, not spoken aloud, but felt deeply. Gratitude for warmth, for shelter, for the simple fact of making it through another winter day. You sense that feeling now, warming you more firmly than the quilts. It settles into you like a quiet ember. You close your eyes again. Behind your eyelids, flickers of firelight still dance. The wind brushes softly outside. The bed holds you gently, its layers of fur, wool, and straw forming a cocoon of tired comfort. You breathe deeply again, and your body responds, softening, sinking, preparing. You are not quite asleep, but you have stepped through the doorway into the place where sleep will soon find you. You draw one final long breath and release it slowly. The frontier night surrounds you, but so does its warmth. The fire hums, the quilts hold, the storm outside swirls. And here on the straw tick, wrapped in quiet layers of effort and resilience, you feel yourself drifting, gently and steadily, into the deep rest that winter nights, even harsh ones, sometimes offered. You lie still beneath the heavy quilts, letting your breath find a slow, easy rhythm as the storm settles into its long night outside. The fire behind you glows in steady pulses, each flicker stretching soft patterns across the rafters. The warmth gathers around you like water rising gently in a quiet pool. You exhale again, deeper this time, and feel the last traces of tension ease from your shoulders. This is the frontier's final gift before sleep, a fragile cocoon of warmth earned through effort, patience, and the simple bravery of making it through another winter day. You shift slightly, feeling the straw beneath you respond with a muted sigh. The unevenness that felt so sharp earlier now feels softened by the weight of the quilts and the warmth gathered in your nightclothes. You imagine a family settling the same way, shoulders touching, feet searching for heated stones, breaths mingling in faint white puffs. You picture the gentle quiet of bodies adjusting, blankets being tucked once more, whispers fading into nothing. This cabin holds those echoes, subtle and warm. You open your eyes for a moment to watch the fire's faint glow. The flames move in slow arcs now, no longer crackling for attention but breathing patiently, almost contentedly. You sense the fire understands its job. Hold the cold at bay just long enough for rest to take hold. And it does so well tonight. You lift your head slightly and glance toward the door. The hide pressed along the threshold lies still. No drafts creep in, no distant knock interrupts. Even the storm's voice has softened into a gentle sweep rather than its earlier howl. You settle back again and draw the quilt closer around your neck. The fabric brushes against your skin with a pleasant weight. You wiggle your toes deeper into the small pocket of warmth at the bed's foot, feeling the last traces of heat from the stone you placed there earlier. It no longer radiates strongly, but it gives off a faint, comforting presence like a memory of warmth instead of heat itself. Frontier sleepers prized these moments. The world outside could roar or freeze or roar and freeze together, but under their blankets, sleep grew like a small flame. You breathe in the scent of pine smoke drifting mildly through the room. The smell mixes with wool, dried herbs, and the faint mineral scent of cold air lingering near the floor. The cabin carries these scents endlessly, imprinting them into dreams. You feel them do the same to you now, anchoring you deeper into the moment. Your breath slows again. Your eyelids grow heavy. You understand in your bones why settlers often described sleep not as something they fell into, but something that slowly, carefully arrived to meet them. You shift onto your side and tuck your hands beneath the quilt. The straw tick's crackle is softer now, almost invisible beneath the quiet hum of the stove. You sense your heartbeat growing deeper, slower, matching the room's gentler rhythm. Another gust of wind brushes the window, then fades. The storm seems to have accepted its role as background music rather than a threat. In this warm half-dark, you imagine a frontier child reaching for a parent's hand under the quilts. You imagine an elder whispering a final thankful sigh. You imagine a tired father relaxing the moment he realizes the storm will not rip the roof free. You imagine a weary mother finally allowing her eyes to close after hours of tending children, fire, drafts, and fears, all of them finding, at least for tonight, enough warmth to sleep. You breathe deeply again and let your head nestle into the pillow. The cabin creaks once more in a tone that sounds almost like agreement. You are ready. The pioneers were ready. The frozen land outside might rage until dawn, but here beneath your patchwork quilt, beneath your warm nightclothes, beside the patient stove,